792 years from the flood to the Exodus event in Egypt.
2235 BC, 1660 AM. By this time Noah was growing grapes and making wine. In this year the youngest son of Noah and Naamah, when Noah is drunk and asleep, Ham, enters the bedchamber. It is not related if he too was drunk. Ham, captivated by the beauty of his mother, Naamah, lies with her. Japheth and Shem are made aware of the trespass, and they cover Naamah's nakedness by walking backwards with a blanket so as not to view her body. In antiquity, it was a curse to see your father's nakedness, which was the unclothed flesh of his wife. When two sexually unite in marriage, they become one flesh. Even in later Israelite law, the nakedness of one's father concerned the bodies of his wife or concubines. Naamah is impregnated and the matter is discovered to Noah. When Canaan is born, Noah curses him through the sexual deviancy of Ham. That Ham was not cursed indicates that Naamah's participation was either consensual or she had opened an occasion for her son Ham to believe she was willing. Ham would later become the king over all humanity in 2012 AD, but after 65 years of reign, he would be deposed by Nimrod and castrated. In Greek mythology, Ham is remembered as Cronus. His son Canaan, through Naamah, would father 7 nations that would later intermarry with giants and assume the curses against the Nephilim and Anunnaki. This is the 868th year of the Kali Yuga, or Black Age timeline, 868 being 434 times 2. The period of 434 years is a judged time epoch. Interestingly, this year is also 4340 years, 434 times 10 to Armageddon, when the curse will be lifted and mankind redeemed by the chief cornerstone. Calendrically, we see here how the Vedic timeline of India is related to Ham. Thus, the population of ancient India were also his descendants prior to the Aryan invasions. 1 Genesis. 2233 BC, 1662 AM. The historian and childhood friend of Alexander the Great of Macedon was Callisthenes. They were related to one another and both had been students of the famous Aristotle. Callisthenes studied the ancient records of Babylon when the Macedonians occupied the city to determine the nation's antiquity. This was performed in 330 BC, and Callisthenes concluded that Babylon's astronomical records spanned back 1903 years, targeting 2233 BC. This is only 6 years off from the flood year of 2239 BC. 2221 BC, 1674 AM. Naamah is 700 years old, Noah 618. She is still youthful and very beautiful and the oldest human alive. Scattered traditions from distant antiquity, for example, the stories of Bochicha, an ancient American Noah, have his wife as a very sexually promiscuous and wicked woman who continually stresses out her holy husband. By this time she has given birth to other sons of Noah, among them one named Arba, the father of the world-famous Anak. This was the 120th year of their marriage since 2341 BC. 2200 BC, 1695 AM. The Roman historian Marcus Varro estimated that this was the year of the flood. This is only 39 years off. The Deluge traditions also concern planet Phoenix and the Phoenix cycles of 552. As we will see, Varro was somewhat knowledgeable about this connection, as will be seen in 1687 BC. 1. Secret Cities of Old South America. 2194 BC, 1701 AM. Ancient Frisian text called the Ora Linde manuscript provides a very graphic description of the flood and attendant disasters. The date of its last composition was 1256 AD, but even then it was admitted that the text was already very old. The copyists wrote that they made their own copy of it 3449 years after the flood. This is only 45 years off. 1. Secret Cities of Old South America. 2179 BC. The Toltec water sun age ends with a terrible flood according to the Spanish Aztec historian Ixtlochitl in the year 1716 of the ancestors' timeline. This is simply a chronological error of the part of early American historiographers. The Toltecs knew that the flood occurred in the 33rd generation, with the pre-flood generations of 50 years being equal with the later Hebrew Jubilees. The flood happened 33.3 Jubilees into the antediluvian world's calendar, Annus Mundi, or 1656 years. But the early Americans from whom the Toltecs received their calendars reckoned generations as 52 years, like those of the Mayan long count, the Olmec and the Maya Itza temple of the cross calendars. The date 1716 was obtained by multiplying 33 times 52 to get 1716. In fact, they got carried away with this method of dating, as found in that the early Americans dated the Tower of Babel incident at 104 years, 52 plus 52, after the flood at the site of Anahuac in archaic Mexico, though the events were really 340 years apart, 2239 to 1899 BC. These early chronologists further wrote that they arrived in the Americas 520 years, 52 times 10 after the Tower of Dispersion, long after their ancestors survived the flood in a box. Intriguingly, they settled in a place called Hu-Anak, a place named in commemoration of the Anunnaki. 1. The antediluvian world. 2. Secret cities of old South America. 2173 BC, 1722 AM. The ancient Earth-killer comet group passes over the ecliptic after 66 years, 792 months, north of the ecliptic on its elliptical orbit, the detritus of Nibiru completing its 396-year orbit. The calendrics for this year are intriguing. This was the 1200 year of the Olmec calendar, or 432,000 days, and 930 of the Vedic, or 792 plus 138, the orbital periods of Nibiru and Phoenix combined. 2139 BC, 1756 AM. Since the mid-19th century AD, researchers of the unique alignments of the Great Pyramid have noted that the scored lines of the descendant passage point at the star Alcyone at about the year 2141 BC. This was cited by E. Raymond Capt, and many decades later it was again calculated at 2141 BC by others. The star Alcyone is in Taurus, the Bull constellation, and Alcyone means the centre. This is of epic importance. John Landseer, reporting for the Royal Institute of Great Britain, Society of Antiquarians, reported in 1822 AD that Chaldean astronomical revelations convey that a conjunction of planet Jupiter and the Sun occurred at the boundary between the zodiacal houses of Taurus and Aries, happened in about 2141 BC, marking the end of the age of the Bull and start of the Ram Age. The actual date is 2 years later, in 2139 BC, as borne out in the calendrics. As Alcyone marks the centre, we see that this year is the epicentral year for an amazing isometric projection. This year was 2170 years after the Phoenix chronology began, with the total destruction of the pre-Adamic world in 4309 BC by the appearance of God executing judgment. Counting 2170 years after this central year, identified in the chronometry of the Great Pyramid, was 32 AD, which marks the appearance of God again on Earth. Confirming this amazing timeline is the fact that 2170 plus 2170 years is exactly 4340 years, or 10 judged time periods of 434 years each. Judged time epochs are the subject of the compelling research of biblical chronologist Stephen Jones in his Secrets of Time. In 4309 BC, the chief cornerstone that the builders Anunnaki rejected destroyed the world of their creation, and 4340 years later, he appeared on earth among men to finalize his work of judgment. 1. The Great Pyramid, Kept. 2. The destruction of Atlantis. 3. When time began, Age of the Ram, Sitchin. 2137 BC, 1758 AM. Chinese records indicate that the sun darkened in this year during Emperor Cheng's reign, and his astrologers were executed for not having predicted it. Because of the slight disparities in the dating of other events before and after the flood by the early Chinese, who described the same events, It is a good possibility that this sun darkening occurred in 2101 BC, the exact year Phoenix appeared for the first time after the Deluge. From this time forward throughout the Old Bronze Age and Late Bronze Age, the ancient were terrified of Phoenix and the reappearance of this celestial object that immersed with the sun was predicted several times through history. See 1135 BC and 583 BC. Eclipse's prediction was too sophisticated at this early date. 1. Our cosmic ancestors. 2121 BC, 1774 AM. Namah is 800 years old, beautiful and regarded by those after the flood as Mother Goddess, known to be the oldest living human. By this time she has given birth to Semiramis, destined to be remembered as the most famous and sexually promiscuous woman of Babylon antiquity. By this time Namah has scorned Noah. Her death is not known, but Enoch's progeny lived on average between 930 and 969 years. 2119 BC, 1776 AM. Canaan went out and discovered a monument of some kind from before the deluge covered in inscriptions left behind by the Anunnaki, their offspring, the giants. Canaan translated these writings and learned that they concerned the motion of celestial bodies, but he hid this knowledge and discovery from Noah at the time because Noah preached against the knowledges and science of the Watchers. This date has calendrics aligned perfectly with other Anunnaki and Nephilim timelines. This is the 720th year of the Anunnaki dynasty that began at Noah's birth, the year of the oppression over the Sethites. That was the year 1056 Annus Mundi, and the discovery of the antediluvian knowledges on astronomy is exactly 4224 years before Armageddon, when the Anunnaki are defeated, or 1056 times 4. This was 1320 years after the descent of the Anunnaki in 3439 BC, or 15,840 months, 7920 plus 7920. This year is the beginning, as suggested by the year 1776 Annus Mundi, 120 years after the flood, 120 years being 1440 months. Canaan was the son of Arphaxad, who was the son of Shem. 1 Jubilees. 2101 BC, 1794 AM. Planet Phoenix makes its first reappearance in the inner solar system after the flood, finishing its 138-year orbit on its way back out to the Kuiper Belt. This may have been recorded by the ancient Chinese. C. 2137 BC. This is 2208 years, or 552 times 4, after the destruction of the pre-Adamic world. From this date on, Phoenix will be observed only in late April and May. 2100 BC, 1795 AM. Scholars are in agreement that reliable dating of events in the Near East begin at this period. Research conducted from the study of Sumero-Babylonian king lists, Assyrian Limu lists, astronomical records, Egyptian papyri, and monumental evidence. The Sumerian king list reveals that after the flood, the first dynasty of Kish was 23 kings ruling 24,510 shahs, evenings and mornings, or 68 years on the old 360-day count year. This means that these kings each took turns ruling over the people for 1080 days, or 3 years, with a 24th king ruling for 30 days before being cut off. The Shah is translated as a perfect circle or completed circle. 1. Extraterrestrials in biblical prophecy. 2012 AD, 1883 AM. In this year, Ham became king over humanity, 226 years after the floodwaters had dried up. The families of Ham, Japheth, Shem, and the other sons and daughters of Noah and Namah were becoming populous. Ham is remembered as Belus, Shem, Kronos, Ammon, and Anam. He would rule for 65 years until violently deposed in 1947 BC by Nimrod, who was known in antiquity at Sumer as Amar-Uda-Ak, and later Babylonian as Merodach or Marduk. Nimrod is the grandson of Ham. This year beginning his kingship was 223 years after he violated Namah in 2235 BC. 223 years being 80,280 days, encoding the cursed Earth sum of 414, which is found twice in 828. This 80,280 days, 828, reflects the curse of Canaan for Ham's sexual trespass, and further demonstrating the curse is the fact that when Ham violated Namar, it began an 828-year countdown to 1407 BC, when the Israelites would slaughter the 7 nations of Canaan and occupy the land of promise. According to the early Greeks, the reign of Cronus was a golden age of peace and prosperity, when people never grew old. This is paralleled in the genealogies of Genesis and Jasher. People born after the flood lived for at the most 400 years, with human longevity declining rapidly afterward. 1. The Greek myths. 1987 BC, 1908 AM. Cush, the son of Ham the king, 25th year of reign, took a new wife, one of the beautiful and tall daughters of Noah and Namar, born after the flood, named Semiramis. By this time after the cataclysm 252 years earlier, there were thousands of people. This 252 years paralleling the 2052 years Earth had been orbiting the present Sun since 4039 BC. Semiramis gave birth to Nimrod. Her brothers would go on to become famous because of their huge size and pedigree. These were the offspring of Arba, a son of Noah after the flood, who fathered the famous Anak, from which the Anakim got their name. These were considered giants because they grew taller and bigger, having been born directly from Namar and Noah, not their sons Japheth, Ham and Shem. The biblical records of the Old Testament record many passages concerning the Anakim, a name attributed to them because of the known histories of the gigantic pre-flood Anunnaki. Anak was named in this fashion. By all accounts, humans prior to the flood not only lived longer, but were much taller and larger than today. The Anakim as sons of Noah enjoyed this antediluvian genetic pedigree. This accounts for how Nimrod was himself described as a giant, much larger than the other people of the earth except the giants. 1 Jasher. 1967 BC, 1928 AM. Nimrod is 20 years old when he received a relic from his father Cush. Earlier, Cush had stolen the lambskin artifact hidden by Noah, an artifact that had been passed down through the Sethite lineage from Adam himself. It was said to be a lambskin from an animal God himself slew to cover Adam's nakedness. This is the origin of the legendary ages of Greek mythology, the goatskin of power that was a divine shield. Nimrod is by now known as a mighty hunter, and the Epic of Gilgamesh was originally about him. He is also the origin of the legends of Heracles. Nimrod was raised as shepherd, but he forsakes this for a career as a hunter. He slays wild animals that have multiplied far more rapidly than mankind had, causing many problems. He sacrifices his catches and kills on altars to God in commemoration of the flood. Nimrod begins teaching men how to build walls, ditches and fortifications. It was his career that early on linked the saviour motif with the hunter, when priorly the saviour was symbolized as a shepherd. Nimrod became a shepherd over the black-headed people, a description for the Sumerians. Amazing association to this history from the book of Jasher and ancient Hebraic writings is found in that the early Chinese called the first people the black-headed people, who were under the guidance of a first ruler of mankind, 1 Jasher, 2 Sargon the Magnificent. 1963 BC, 1932 AM. Planet Phoenix entered the inner solar system, completing its 138-year orbit on its way back out to the Kuiper Belt. 1947 BC, 1948 AM. This year is a most amazing calendrical nexus between the Annus Mundi and the modern Gregorian calendars. Abraham was born in this year according to the 1,000-year-old commentary on the Talmud by Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzhaki, and Flavius Josephus, who wrote that Abraham was born on the 292nd year after the flood. This 1947 BC date is confirmed by the biblical chronologist Stephen Jones in his Secrets of Time, and in 1839 A.M.M. Noah wrote that an accurate accounting of Abraham's life reveals that he was born in the year 1948 AM. in his preface to the English translation of the Book of Jasher. Abraham was born in the only year that overlapped between 1948 Annus Mundi and 1948-47 BC. In a unique parallel, the nation of Israel was reborn in 1948 Anno Domini. Abraham was born Abram, the son of Terah, a Babylonian general. After 20 years of strife and fighting with the Japhethites, the Hamites, led by a 40-year-old Nimrod, attack the Japhethites as these people are weakened by a sudden earthquake. The Japhethites are overthrown in battle. This story is very old and recorded in the Book of Jasher. However, we have confirmation of this story in the ancient Greek account of Hesiod, in his Theogony, when an earthquake, howling winds, and a heat wave afflicted the Titans, Japhethites, when they were banished by Zeus. Zeus's career to the Greeks mirrors the Semitic stories of Nimrod. Ham is dethroned after ruling for 65 years, according to the chronologies available to Augustine over 16 centuries ago. He recorded this in his City of God. Nimrod is chosen as king, and he castrates his grandfather Ham as a judicial act for violating Namah in 2235 BC, exactly 288 years priorly, 144 plus 144. Then Nimrod commits an act incurring the anger of God when he castrates the holy patriarch Noah, which was not a judicial act but done out of fear. Noah's sons were gigantic, the Anakim, who were banished to the west. This banishment to the west is a major theme of the early Greek traditions of the sons of Deucalion, the Greek Noah called the new wine sailor. The Anakim travel to the far west and build for themselves the mighty Mycenae, erecting the famous Lion's Gate fortress. Nimrod feared that the ever-virile Noah would keep impregnating concubines and fathering these immense people. Other races of giants were the Rephaim, the Emims, Zuzims, and Zamzumins. All of these races are mentioned in the Old Testament records. Some Anakim settle in Canaan. Nimrod then marries his own mother, the tall and beautiful Semiramis, the daughter of Noah and Namah. This was not an incestual move, but a political one. In the ancient Near East, imperial power descended through the female line. Many times a king ruled as the son of the Great Mother. The people relocate 2 days' walk to the east and begin laying the foundation of great cities along the Euphrates. This is the first regnal year of Nimrod as Amar Uda Ak. This is 868 years after completion of the Great Pyramid, or 2 judged time periods of 434 years each. 1. Rashi, Talmud Sanhedrin, Leviticus Rabbi. 2. Antiquities. 3. Book of Jasher, Alcuin VII. 4. Jasher. 5. Theogony. 6. Children of the Sun. 1937 BC, 1958 AM. Abram is 10 years old when he is taken out of hiding and taken to live in the house of Noah. At his birth, the court astrologers saw a strange star vision and determined that a child had been born whose seed would overthrow King Nimrod. The child was found to be that of General Terah, who took the child of a maidservant to Nimrod, who killed the child. Abram was secreted away from Shinar. Abram begins a 30-year study under the ancient Noah, who was 902 years old, learning the pre-flood histories, sciences, the mysteries and the elder faith, as well as the prophecies of Adam, Seth and Enoch. Noah taught Abram the secrets of Akhuzan, Giza pyramid complex in Egypt, and the ancient patriarch taught Abram how to translate the pre-flood script. The Great Pyramid at that time was underwater in the southern Mediterranean, where the Egyptian delta lies today. By earthquake in 1899 BC, the entire region would be elevated, the delta created and the pyramid found half buried. This was the 400th year from the birth of Shem, patriarch of the Semitic people. 1 Jasher. 1919 BC, 1976 AM. By this date the reign of Nimrod as king of Shinar and over humanity was secure, but mankind was becoming very populous. Starting with 4 females 1 year after the flood, with each of them having 2 daughters, in a 20-year period, the rate of reproduction is astonishing. Under the old patriarchal cultures, men had wives and concubines. The Great Flood was a fact in the post-apocalyptic period. and the duty of all people was to be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. The Noahic command recorded in Genesis. After 320 years, there were at the base minimum 262,144 females, the whole population being at least 520,000 humans, all descended from 8 people who survived the deluge. Even this most conservative estimate, at 20-year-long intervals, still has the base population figure 20 years after this date at 524,288 females, or over 1 million people. It must be remembered that at this time humans lived for 4 and 3 centuries easily, human longevity declining rapidly. By this date, very few people have died of old age. The true population at this time would be about 1.5 million. Groups of people, clans and families by this time have begun branching out to populate Syria, Aram, Canaan, Lebanon, Anatolia, Asia Minor, Phoenicia, Mycenae, Sumer, Elam, Harappan Valley cultures, Susa, Crete, northern India, Haran. Nimrod is known to the entire world, the seat of empire at Shinar, Sumer, and his exploits are immortalized in global mythological tradition. The king is the hunter, a renowned warrior and wrestler, a lawgiver and king. A dispute with Noah's sons, the Anakim, 10 years earlier, now has Nimrod boasting that he defeated the Anunnaki themselves. Historic records from the Near East reveal that Sargon I, Nimrod, claimed to have vanquished the 7 kings renowned from pre-flood antiquity. Later, Nimrod would assume the title Hammurabi, and he would claim to have defeated the 7 sages. These are dynastic claims made to secure his rule over the people. For these claims, many groups splintered away, knowing him to be dishonest and an enemy of God. In the early Americas, Nimrod was remembered as the giant Glooskap, called the Liar. The belief the people had in Nimrod led to a further abomination. Many people now venerated Nimrod's mother and wife, the beautiful and tall Semiramis, daughter of Noah and Nama, as a goddess. Her brothers were the Anakim, called Titans in Old Greek lore. It was here that we have the origin of the goddess war god motif, the mother and son that found its way into the early iconography of almost every nation on this planet. In this year, Abram is 28 years old, Noah is 920 years old. 1915 BC, 1980 AM. The Anunnaki planet Nibiru enters the inner solar system and passes through it after 732 years in the deepest southern space below the ecliptic. It now begins its 60-year journey north of the ecliptic to finish its 792-year orbit. Some interesting calendrics. This was 1188 from the start of the Black Age, the Kali Yuga, which is an Anunnaki-related timeline. 1188 is 108 times 11, the number 11 being a sum identifying the Anunnaki according to the Babylonian Enuma Elish cuneiform tablet texts. This was the 900th year from completion of the Great Pyramid, and 324 years after the Deluge, or 108 times 3. Recall that the pyramid was finished in the year 1080 Annus Mundi, 2815 BC. In this year, the Babylonians recorded a great blackness that swallowed the stars, a dark god from below that they called Tiamat, a sky dragon with 7 heads that the Egyptians and later Greeks called Typhon. Typhon's arms stretched 100 leagues in either direction, and instead of hands he had serpents' heads. His head touched the stars, and his vast wings darkened the sun while flaming rocks hit the ground. The legends of Typhon, Nibiru, actually provides more evidence of Planet Phoenix as well. In the myth of Typhon, the monster in space has a sister, also connected to the darkening of the sun, another monster alien planet named Delphine, which preserves the root in Phone-Ix, Del-Fine. Hesiod's Theogony preserves this event as occurring a short time after Zeus, Nimrod, conquered the Titans, Japhethites and Anakim. Hesiod wrote that Typhon appeared in the sky with strange heads, old designation for comets, with black tails. The dragon heads gave off flames and vibrated the earth with noises as mountains trembled. Thunderbolts struck the earth as waters boiled until a fiery hurricane was born. Earthquakes shook the lands and the sea overextended its bounds. The disaster concluded with powerful lightning bolt flashing between Earth and Typhon, which gave rise to the innumerable legends of a hero god who slew a sky monster with his Labris thunderbolt, later stylized into a battle axe. The thunderbolt was a flux tube of immense electrical energy that passed between two planets, first witnessed by modern scientists in 1994 AD, when comet Shoemaker-Levy 9 collided into Jupiter. This was Nibiru's first appearance after the flood, a phenomenon associated to the Anunnaki. At this date, the Near East literally explodes with cuneiform tablet inscriptions concerning the Anunnaki, gods that must be prayed to and sacrificed to in order to keep them away. 32nd year of the reign of Nimrod. 1. The Greek myths. 3. Theogony. 1900 BC, 1995 AM. Scholars estimate that the mysterious Amorite king of Babylon, Hammurabi, died about 1900 to 1680 BC. This is a 220-year period, an approximation. The fact is that Hammurabi was a title given to Sargon I of Akkad, only after the disaster of 1899 BC. Hammurabi is from Amurapi, which itself derives from Amraphel. Nimrod was born in 1987 BC and lived 215 years to 1772 BC, when Esau, a descendant of Abraham, murdered him. Nimrod would have lived much longer. 1899 BC, 1996 AM. King Nimrod is almost finished with his major architectural project called the Tower of Babel. The structure was never a tower in the conventional sense, but a gigantic pyramid erected to replace the altar of God, Great Pyramid of Giza, lost in the Deluge. The Giza complex at this date has been under sea in the southern Mediterranean off the coast of Egypt for 340 years. The land is so overpopulated by this time, 2 million at least, that during the construction of the high structure, men were not mourned when they were hurt or killed, but the other workers were angered when bricks were damaged on their way to being set in place. The pyramid construction went on for almost 2 decades and incurred the wrath of the Creator. At this time the speech of men was understood by all, a variant of the speech of those from before the flood. This universal language is attested to in the old Sibylline oracles, in several passages in ancient texts found in cuneiform, as will be shown in this research and in the following references. Once upon a time, the whole universe, the people in unison, to Enlil in one tongue gave praise. Sumerian text, Emukar and the Lord of Aratta. And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech, Genesis 11:1. And all the earth was of one tongue and words of union, Jasher 7:46. As the project drew to a close, the dark satellite, a rock and metal moon once in the train of Nibiru, passed close to Earth as the flux tube electrical discharge struck the pyramid structure, electrocuting many people. At that instant, a massive continental earthquake rocked northern Africa, and the entire southern Mediterranean basin was elevated. The post-flood shoreline was moved northward 108 miles, and the receding seawater passed over the elevated seabed and limestone plateau, creating the delta rivers of the Nile. As will be shown in this research, there is much proof that the Great Pyramid and Giza region was under the sea for an extended period of time, and that this was known to our predecessors. In fact, early Egypt was not called Egypt at all, but the raised land, because a god raised the land out of the seas. In Shinar, the tower was vaporized along its upper third in a storm of vitrified detritus, as the quakes vibrate the earth, and swallowed a third of the workers. Entire districts of Shinar were destroyed, and hundreds of thousands of people died. About 750,000 people fled in all directions with their possessions. The topography of the world changed as civilizations fragmented into migrating groups, some travelling as far as distant America before further global changes from meltwater seas from glacial landmasses closed the natural land bridges off with oceans. The inhabitants of the fertile Nile Valley found themselves battling groups of people escaping the chaos to wander into their territory. 7 clans in the Nile Valley fought amongst one another, with Mitzrayim the victor. This is why the Old Testament records often refer to the Egyptians or their country as Mitzrayim. The clans that were driven off became the Philistines, Cretans, Minoans, Pelasgians, and other Aegean tribes that would later become powerful and unified by this ancient history to become the infamous Sea Peoples Federation throughout the Mediterranean that would fight in the famous Trojan War. This war for Egypt was called the Ethiopic War. Egypt is settled by the descendants of Ham, and Ham is remembered as Anam, who the later Egyptians called Mena, Menes, and Ammon. He ruled the first dynasty. In Shinar, the survivors that remained, still a dense population, renamed Sargon I as Amraphel, Ugaritic Amurapi, a name in their speech meaning "he made us fall" from their position as seat of empire. Nimrod was still king, not an emperor. The people gathered the remaining bricks and building materials and abandoned their pyramid to build the cities of Erech, Uruk, Akkad, Calneh, and Babel, Babylon. Archaeologists have found the immense ruinous pile of vitrified bricks, noting that all usable bricks had been removed from the site. The dark satellite will maintain a regular orbit throughout history. The stories of this disaster claim that evil angels descended to afflict the people. This is the same thing that will happen when the dark satellite arrives in 2052 AD to bring the 7 Anunnaki kings that were imprisoned at the Deluge. This was the 48th year of Nimrod's reign in Abram's life. Noah was 940 years old. 1. Jasher. 2. The Wars of Gods and Men. 1898 BC, 1997 AM. In this year, the son of Ham, Anam of Egypt, named Osiris, ascends to the throne of Mitzrayim in the Nile Valley. This is the man whom the later Egyptians deified as the god Osiris. Ammon was castrated 49 years earlier by Nimrod, so Osiris is at least 49 years old. At this date, the Elamites are in desperate need of resources and building materials in the Harappan Valley, and the Elamite army under the leadership of Chedorlaomer, called in the Near East tablet inscriptions Kudurlagama, invades Egypt. In the Genesis record, this story is the background for Genesis 14. In Jasher, we find that Chedorlaomer was a war general under Nimrod in Shinar before the tower incident. Nimrod is depicted upon seals and vessels at Harappa and Mohenjo-daro as Pashupati, or Lord of the Animals, a horned man bearing a trident, Labris. The Elamites built cities all throughout the Harappan regions in the Indus Valley, along the modern Pakistani-Indian borders. Chedorlaomer marched an army around the northern regions of Sumer and Akkad, ignoring the realm of Nimrod to invade Canaan, subduing the cities of the plain called Sodom and Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Bela, cities found mentioned in the Ugaritic seals. These Canaanites were compelled to pay annual tribute of bitumen and salt from the shores of the Salt Sea, called Dead Sea today. Bitumen is a fossil fuel byproduct used for making glue, oils, and caulking ships. Taking auxiliaries from Canaan, the Elamite army then marched into Egypt and subdued them in the first regnal year of Osiris. This year is the 440th year since the birth of Ham in 2338 BC, or 158,400 days, which is 79,200 days twice over. The Elamites were Semitic and conquered the Canaanites and Egyptians, two nations descended from Ham. This begins the fulfillment of Noah's curse of Canaan and Ham. Noah is 941 years old and Abram is 49, 1 Jasher. 1895 BC, 2000 AM. This is Sargon I's, Nimrod, third year campaigning in the west. He subdued Syria and Cyprus, deporting the inhabitants east to Akkad. Ancient Omen texts in Babylon attest that Agade, Akkad, was founded right after Sargon's first invasion of the west. As the Elamites garrisoned Canaan and Egypt, Nimrod of Babylon leaves those areas alone, even leaving alone the Elamites to the east. He concentrates on the Euphrates-Tigris regions and their northern and northwestern areas to extend his rule. Nimrod's greatest city at this time is Erech, Uruk, called the Old City. Abram is 52 years old. 1. Sargon the Magnificent. 1892 BC, 2003 AM. 7 years after the Babel disaster, the leading families of the East lost out in a contest of lots and were banished for 13 years. These were the Pandavas, led by Yudhishthira in the Indian Mahabharata text, but he was called Chedorlaomer in the Near East tablet inscriptions and in Genesis 14. The banishment for 13 years was the subject of much communication in the old documents. In this year the wise prophet Vyasa said, "Much of sorrow and suffering is in store for 13 years to come." The portents indicate the destruction of the Kshatriya race. Hundreds of kings will perish, and the old order of things will pass away. The law of the lots was instituted after the flood by Noah, when his sons and his sons' sons pulled lots to see where they would take their families for settlement. This year is exactly 120 years after Ham began to rule in 2012 BC. This was the 55th year of the life of Abram, 55 years since Nimrod first ruled as king. 1. Mahabharata. 1889 BC, 2006 AM. The venerable patriarch Noah dies at age 950 years old, born in 2830 BC, the first year of the oppression of the Nephilim over the Sethites. The early Sumerians called him Utnapishtim and the far away because he chose to live in the west, in Canaan, with his son Shem, known to the locals as the priest Melchizedek, a high priest carrying on the elder faith of the pre-flood ancestors. In this year Shem was 448 years old. His older brother Japheth, firstborn of Noah, was 450 years old. Widespread mourning leads to the arrival of envoys and kings from distant lands, who come to pay their respects to the family of the Ancient One. With these arrivals from the west in the region later known as the Peloponnese, or Mycenae, were some of the Anakim, the old sons of Noah. They stay in Canaan as evidenced in the biblical records of Joshua and Numbers. This is the 1224th year of the Mayan calendar, a number that will be shown over and over throughout this research to be indicative of a covenanted people. This was the 58th year of Abram's life. 1885 BC, 2010 AM. After 13 years since Elam conquered Canaan and Egypt, the cities of the plain, Sodom and Gomorrah, at the edge of the Salt Sea, Dead Sea, rebelled and ceased paying their annual tribute after 12 years of vassalage. The Elamites were at this time building great cities, their own soldiers, now conscripted labourers, and they did nothing about the insurgency at this time. In the Euphrates-Tigris valleys, Nimrod too was empire building. His seat at the new city of Babel, named in commemoration of the Tower incident, Babel means confusion. His dominion had spread from Sumer, Akkad, Babylonia, Assyria, Haran, Aram, Syria, Anatolia of the Hittites as far as Asia Minor. Now powerful, Nimrod sent messages to his former general Chedorlaomer in Elam to submit back under his command. In the Sumerian text, Enmerkar and the lord of Arata, Nimrod is Enmerkar and Chedorlaomer is the lord of Arata, Harappa, where we find Enmerkar appealing to the lord of Arata to return certain objects and submit to his authority. But the lord of Arata responds with a message claiming that he cannot understand what language the message is, therefore cannot respond to it. The rebellion of the Hamitic peoples of Canaan is 70 times 5 years, 350, since Canaan was cursed by Noah in 2235 BC. This revolt is 744 plus 744 on the Olmec Hamitic timeline. Though the Olmec calendar is an Enochian one, the Olmecs were of Hamitic stock in Central America. This was the 62nd year of the life of Abram. 1879 BC, 2016 AM. After 5 full years passed after Sodom and Gomorrah rebelled against Elam, the king of Babylon waited no longer. Nimrod believed that Elam's silence indicated weakness, for Chedorlaomer did nothing to punish the Sodomites. In this year Nimrod assembles a truly vast host of Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, Hurrians, Arameans, Amorites, Hittites, as well as a formidable contingent of giants of Rephaim and Anakim stock. Nimrod marched his army toward Elam on his way to the most famous battle of the ancient world, known as the Battle of Kuruksata. In his host was a nephew called Tidal in Genesis 14, but Tudul of the Hittites. Another king was Arioch, a son of Nimrod, who reigned over Sumer, as well as Mardon, a detested son of Nimrod, even despised by Semiramis the queen. Mardon was truly gigantic. Remember, his mother was Semiramis, the tall daughter of Noah, and bloodthirsty. Mardon is remembered by the Greco-Roman world as Ares, Mars, the violent god of war, who was in the Babylonian annals called Martu. Chedorlaomer met Nimrod's army with an inferior force of 5,000 men, outnumbered by Nimrod 7-11. The start of the Battle of Kuruksata in the Mahabharata is the first recorded instance of a famous Bronze Age institution known as the Heroic Code. Before the terrible battle commenced, both sides watched numerous single combats between renowned warriors. The 13 years preceding the battle is mentioned about a dozen times throughout the Mahabharata text. The Elamites slaughter the armies of Nimrod, and this war saw the end of several famous giants. Mardon was killed. In humiliation, Nimrod, Arioch, and Tidal are subjected to Elamite rule, and children are taken as security. Babylonia garrisoned with Elamite troops. Chedorlaomer becomes overlord of the Euphrates-Tigris basin. Scholars have linked the lord of Arata to Harappa, the Indus Valley cities. The Battle of Kuruksata was over the right to the fossil fuel products of Canaan, for it was Nimrod's intent to defeat the Elamites and then secure his dominion westward into Canaan to the cities of the plain. This battle occurred in the year 2016 Annus Mundi, or 1008 plus 1008 years, and it was 2160 years, 1080 times 2, since Earth had assumed its present orbit around the Sun. The Elamites were early peoples of India, and in the Indian Vedic timeline we see this as 1224. This was 360 years after the Deluge. This was the 68th year of Abram's life. 1. Mahabharata. 3. The Wars of Gods and Men. A Queen Am I. Sitchin, a letter from Hammurabi. 1877 BC, 2018 AM. Abram leaves Haran among the Hurrians, his kin, and follows the instructions of God to go to Canaan. In Canaan, the future land of Israel, Abram's name is changed to Abraham, and he enters a covenant with God. God promises him that his seed shall become mighty nations and spread across the face of the earth, his descendants more than the stars for multitude. He is told that through his descendants, all the nations of the world will be blessed. His progeny will first be slaves in Egypt, but will later come out of bondage with great wealth. In biblical chronology, the Abrahamic covenant is instituted 430 years before the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt in 1447 BC. The date of 1447 BC for the exodus is well proven. Eusebius, in his Chronicon, also counted the 430 years from the promises made to Abraham to the exodus. The story of the promises is in Genesis and Jasher. The fulfillment of these promises has totally eluded modern Christians. Today it is taught that this covenant is fulfilled by the re-emergence of the tiny nation-state of Israel in Palestine. But the nation of modern Israel has not at all fulfilled any of these conditions. The descendants of Abraham have literally filled the earth today, and who they are and what they have done to bless the nations will be fully disclosed in this research. Abraham is 70 years old. 1. Augustine, City of God. 2. Genesis. Jasher. 1872 BC, 2023 AM. Abraham is a very powerful man by this time, with an extensive house. He and his nephew Lot separate, their flocks and herds too large for any one area to support them. Lot chooses to dwell in the plain of Sodom, a lush valley, and Abraham returns to Canaan after 5 years in Egypt. In Canaan he finds famine, so he went to Egypt. He is 75 years old and dwells again in Canaan. Chedorlaomer brings his army of Elamites into Babylonia and summons the armies of Nimrod, Amraphel, Arioch or Sumer, and Akkad and Tidal of Anatolia. This massive host passes over into Syria and south into the land of the giants called Bashan and Argob, vanquishing the giants called Emims, Zuzims, and Zamzumins, giants living in Canaan. The Elamite Confederation then crushes the Amorites on the way towards Sodom and Gomorrah. The attack from the north left the Sodomites and Gomorrites defenceless, and their armies were routed and chased off into the lime pits bordering the Salt Sea. The invasion route was down the King's Highway, a famous road in antiquity. Sodom and Gomorrah are sacked, the women and children taken with many of the people and their herds and livestock. Among the captives was Lot, nephew of Abraham. The Elamite Confederation camps near Damascus, close to the famous pre-flood foundation of megalithic blocks called Baalbek. The ancient stone tablets called the Chedorlaomer texts confirm the Genesis account, for all of the participants of the Elamite Confederation are named and the route they took, invading Canaan, is specifically given. This invasion was due to a rebellion that occurred 13 years earlier. Abraham discovers the matter and summons his allies, 318 Anakim giants, the sons of Noah and 3 Amorite chieftains with their forces, and the combined groups form an army led by Abraham that falls upon the drunk and celebrating Elamite Confederation outside Damascus. The small forces slay thousands, sending men panicking into the wilderness, as the kings Chedorlaomer, Tidal, and Arioch are captured and put to the sword. Nimrod, Amraphel, escapes, his own deliverance foretold to him in a prophecy the same night he dreamed that his death would come to him by the seed of Abraham. The death and defeat of Chedorlaomer is evidenced in the thousands of years old letter from Hammurabi, where we read a demand from Hammurabi for the return of temple virgins taken priorly by Chedorlaomer. This demand could never have been made had not Chedorlaomer first forcibly taken them to Elam before losing power to Babylon. Sodom and the cities of the plain are given back their possessions and people, and this begins 24 years of prosperity and isolationism. The Sodomites and their Canaanite neighbours grow famously rich, and their prosperity results in a degeneration into hedonism and public demonstrations of torture of foreigners and locals caught helping them. With unlimited resources from their proceeds from the mineral harvesting from the Salt Sea, they still refuse to feed the poor or clothe them, give strangers lodging, food or water, and they became a byword among the nations for their highway piracy, the rich taking from the poor. Abraham meets with Shem, who is 465 years old and called Melchizedek, a high priest in Canaan. Nimrod, free of Elamite dominion, secures his reign over his kingdom. At this time, Amorites from Mitanni are populating his dominions. 1. Genesis. 2. The wars of gods and men. Abraham, the fateful years. Sichin. 3. Genesis. Jasher. 1867 BC, 2028 AM. In the 31st year of Hammurabi, Nimrod, Babylon annexes Larsa and all of southern Mesopotamia. He would forge another empire by his 35th year. This dating is the Amorite dating from 1898 BC, when Nimrod was Amraphel, and had to begin his kingdom all over again after the 1899 BC Babel dispersion. The Amorites were a widespread and numerous people, spread throughout Canaan, Aram, Mitanni, and Babylonia. The Euphrates-Tigris basin, teeming with Amorites. Nimrod grants them citizenship for their allegiance. In this year, Nimrod officially becomes Hammurabi of the Amorite dynasty of Babylon. Migrations of Amorites make Hammurabi a mighty king, and his armies are replenished virtually overnight with the power of Elam broken. In this year, the city of Nineveh is finished and Ashur fortified. These were located in the north, in what would later be Assyria. Hammurabi took on a dynastic name, Samu-Abi, which means Shem is my father. This was a lie, but many kings took fictitious names in antiquity to secure their rule over peoples of different stock. 1. The Assyrians and Babylonians. 2. Sargon the Magnificent. 1861 BC, 2034 AM. Abraham, married to Sarah, took another wife named Hagar, the daughter of Pharaoh of Egypt. Hagar gives birth to Abraham's first son, Ishmael, the son of the bondwoman. Sarah is offended and destitute, a woman of extraordinary beauty who has been barren all of her life. This is the 86th year of Abraham's life and the 476th year of the life of Shem. In the Phoenix chronology, this is 2448, which is the year of cataclysm in ancient Egypt, being the year 1447 BC, when the Israelite descendants of Abraham depart Egypt in the Exodus after the terrible plagues and disasters. Interestingly, Ishmael's birth marks a 414-year cursed earth period to 1447 BC. Also, this is the year 1242 of the Vedic calendar, or 414 times 3 years from the start of the Black Age. 1 Genesis. 1856 BC, 2039 AM. The Chittim made war against the children of Tubal in the 91st year of Abraham's life. The people of Chittim and Tubal were kin, being Japhethites who dwelt in ancient Italy. The Chittim took up for their dwelling the river Tiber, but the people of Tubal lived at Tuscana, known today as Tuscany. The Tubalites built the city to Sabina and were later called the Sabines, renowned for having the most beautiful daughters. The nations around would come to receive the daughters of Tubal, but after the Chittim made war against them, they refused any of the Chittim from receiving their daughters. 1 Jesher. 1855 BC, 2040 AM. The Anunnaki planet Nibiru descends back over the ecliptic after 60 years north of it, completing its 792 years orbit. It will not be back for 732 years. A train of debris that fractured off the surface of Nibiru begins its own orbit around the Sun, breaking free of Nibiru's gravitational pull to become the Sodom Trojan Apocalypse Group. 1853 BC, 2052 AM. After the Tubalites refused the Chittim their daughters for 3 years, the Chittim went to the city of Sabina and abducted the young Sabine women when the men were out in the fields at harvest. The Sabines and their allies attacked the Chittim, but the war was abandoned when the Chittim at the walls held up the babies born from their unions. The Tubalites retreated back home, and this was the first rape of the Sabines, famous in history. The book of Jasher reads that, "And the children of Chittim are the Romim, who dwell in the valley of Canopia by the river Tibru, the Romans near the river Tiber." This reveals that the rape of the Sabines, famous in Roman history, was a repeated occurrence from distant antiquity. It also demonstrates that the later copyists of the Jasher record, which was written in Hebrew, did so sometime after 753 BC, for they were familiar with the name of Rome, Romim, which did not exist priorly. The first Italians were Chittim, or Japhethites. 1 Jesher. 1849 BC, 2046 AM. Earth passes right through the strewn field of the Sodom Trojan Apocalypse Group, and extraterrestrial materials from the surface of Nibiru saturate the atmosphere and rain down on the Fertile Crescent. Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities of the plain are totally destroyed in fire from the sky, as the detritus of comets and meteorites with combustible materials fall upon the region around the Salt Sea. The cities had been constructed of the bituminous mortar and bricks, and they burn, killing all the inhabitants. The burning along the ground and the intensity of the extraterrestrial storm fossilized people standing near the Salt Sea. Lot's wife was one of these victims. The enemies of Sodom and Gomorrah met the same fate. Mohenjo-Daro and the other Harappan cities of the Indus Valley were obliterated by storms from the sky. Archaeologists have recently excavated these desolate cities and found skeletons in the streets, unmarked by weapons, some holding children and others holding hands, all laid out as if they watched their destruction coming. Russian scientists found that the radioactivity levels of these skeletons was much higher than it was supposed to be. Thousands of congealed black stones have been found all over Mohenjo-daro. The King's Highway used by the Elamites to invade Sodom and Gomorrah is mentioned in an ancient tablet text which reads that the cities along the King's Highway were destroyed by a disaster. Roman historian Tacitus relates that at the edge of the Dead Sea were once great cities. Between Sodom and Gomorrah and the Indus Valley ruins was Sumer and Lower Mesopotamia. This disaster did not leave them unscathed. The lamentation texts of Sumer reveal that the ruin of their own cities was connected to the destruction of cities in the west. These texts reveal that the vast urban centres of Ur, Uruk, Nippur, Ediru, among others, were laid waste, lying in heaps, young laying in their mothers' laps, fires ablaze. An evil wind brought the fiery destruction. Though southern Mesopotamia was ravaged by the same destruction as the Indus and Sodom Valley, Babylon was actually empowered again as refugees filtered into their untouched cities. In fact, according to Sitchin, the world-famous Sumerian scholar, Elamites joined the peoples of Babylonia. The story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is a major biblical theme. More can be read about it in Anunnaki Homeworld. Abraham was 98 years old. The greatest significance of this story to our times concerns its calendrical parallel with our own last-day civilization. We have seen already that Nibiru is destined to orbit until it nearly collides into Earth in 2046 AD, and the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was in the year 2046 Annus Mundi. There is deity in the design, we have been warned. 1. Genesis, Jasher. 2. Survivors of Atlantis. 3. Humanity's extraterrestrial origins, citing Sitchin. 4. Tacitus, The Histories. 5. When Time Began, Age of the Ram, Sitchin. 1847 BC, 2048 AM. Abraham is 100 years old when his son Isaac is born to his wife Sarah in her old age in the Philistine city of Gerar. Isaac is the beginning of the fulfillment of the promise God made to Abraham that his seed would fill the earth and bless the nations, made 30 years earlier in 1877 BC, 30 years being 10,800 days. This is the 490th year of the life of Shem, who was still alive, the patriarch of Semitic peoples and ancestor of Abraham. Genesis. 1843 BC, 2052 AM. Abraham is 104 years old, 52 times 2, when the ancient Earth-killer comet group passes back through the inner system after 330 years below the ecliptic. 1837 BC, 2058 AM. The ancient Egyptian civilization that we have come to know was born in this year with the discovery and excavation of the Great Pyramid. At the flood in 2239 BC, the site of Akuzan, Giza, was buried in sediments, and when the floodwaters receded to the poles with the continental plates now fractured, the Mediterranean Sea covered Lower Egypt. The early coast of Egypt was 108 miles further inland, and this is why the earliest metropolis of the Egyptians was Waset, Karnak, Thebes and those cities of Upper Egypt hundreds of miles into the African interior. For 62 years since 1899 BC, the geography of Egypt had changed with a quake that elevated northern Africa, lifting the half-buried pyramids and sphinx of the Giza complex out of the sea. This elevation created the geographical anomaly known as the Egyptian Nile Delta, called the Nine Bows long ago. Lower Egypt was the raised land. The Egyptians discovered the gigantic pyramids and immediately attributed them to Thoth, Egyptian Enoch. They excavated the site, removing thousands of tons of sediments, seashells and debris, as others built the nearby city of Anu, called On in the Old Testament and later known as Heliopolis. The Westcar Papyrus relates that a venerable old man who was 110 years old visited Egypt to astonish the king because he knew the number of the chambers of Thoth, which some Egyptologists translate as secret chambers of the primeval sanctuary. This old man claimed to know where the plans with numbers were hidden. He could translate the writings of Thoth. The stranger was a shepherd, and in some Egyptian accounts he was called Philistis. These facts identify this man as Abraham, born in 1947 BC and was 110 years old, who had extensive flocks and herds mentioned in Genesis and Jasher, and was in that same year living among the Philistines at Gerar. Abraham could translate the writings on the lower surface of the Great Pyramid's casing blocks, because Noah had taught him how to understand the antediluvian script. Thoth was a prophet, scribe of the gods, an architect and healer. Enoch. Abraham's presence in ancient Egypt explains a number of peculiarities. Origen wrote that no one among the Egyptians were allowed to study geometry or astronomy until they had been circumcised. This was the sign of the Abrahamic covenant God instituted in 1877 BC, exactly 40 years earlier. Eusebius wrote that Abraham taught the science of astrology to the Egyptians at Heliopolis. Scholars have long been critical of ancient Israelite institutions, finding their precedents in Egyptian traditions and texts, not realizing that the early Egyptian priesthoods were influenced and guided by Abraham. The Egyptian Book of the Dead was originally known as the Book of Thoth, and was also referred to as the Book of Life, or Ritual of the Resurrection of Life. It was said that these writings were originally taken from off the surfaces of the Great Pyramid, which was called the Per-Amrid, a name used to denote the Book of the Dead. This Book of the Dead was discovered during the First Dynasty according to 11th century BC coffin texts, which relate that they were found upon a wonderful object, a thing of great mystery, the like of which had never before been seen or looked upon. These monuments in Egypt were called the Pillar of Set, Abraham knowing that they had been erected by the Sethites. The Great Pyramid was finished in 1080 Annus Mundi, 2815 BC, exactly 972 years, 108 times 9 before this date. Abraham possessed a tablet of symbols by which he used to know the past, present and future, reminiscent of the Sumerian tablet of destinies. Old Arabian traditions affirm that Abraham's connection to the Great Pyramid is that they relate that he opened a very ancient coffer and discovered therein the truly old books of his ancestors Adam, Seth and Enoch. This concerns the sarcophagus in the king's chamber that once had a granite sliding lid atop it. The proofs that Abraham had visited Egypt to translate the Enochian writings from off the surfaces of the Great Pyramid is a subject of lost scriptures of Giza. Before the deluge, Abraham's ministry was prophesied by an angel to Enoch who said, "After the flood shall arise another generation much afterwards. He who raised that generation, Abraham, shall reveal to them the books of thy handwriting, Enoch's. Of thy fathers, to them he must point out the guardianship of the world." Abraham's learning and knowledge was passed down from Shem and Noah, both men living before the flood. Noah was born in 2839 BC, and his guidance came from Methuselah, the ancient son of Enoch. From Adam to Noah, only Methuselah was needed for the transference of information to Abraham, this being over 2,000 years. The discovery of the Pillars of Set quickly spread along the trade routes of the ancient world. The sages and scribes of even distant countries made journeys to Egypt, knowing that the stories from before the flood related that the truth about Earth's past and future were conveyed upon the casing blocks of the monument. Gnostic traditions affirm this. In the Kybalion we read, "From the land of the Ganga, India, many advanced occultists wandered to the land of Egypt, and sat at the feet of the Master. From other lands also came the learned ones, all of whom regarded Hermes as the master of masters, and his influence was so great that in spite of the many wanderings from the path on the parts of the centuries of teachings in these different lands, there may still be found a certain basic resemblance and correspondence which underlies the many and quite divergent theories entertained and taught by the occultists of these different lands today." The Hermes traditions refer both to Enoch before the flood and Abraham after it. Iamblichus wrote that Hermes wrote 20,000 books, and the Egyptian priest historian Manetho of Alexandria wrote that Hermes wrote 36,000 books. This confusion was born from the knowledge that long ago there was a tremendous amount of literature available that was copied from the surface text of the Great Pyramid. Hermes is often connected to Thoth. Over 22 centuries ago, Manetho wrote that before the cataclysm in Egypt, Thoth inscribed upon stelae, known as Assyriatic columns, pillars, the principles of all knowledge. After the flood, at a later period, the second Thoth came to Egypt and translated these writings in the vulgar tongue of men, the original text written in a sacred language. Abraham would spent 12 years, 144 months among the Egyptian priesthood and at the Giza site translating the Enochian records. The scholars from Egypt, Sumer and Akkad, Babylon, Aram, Phoenicia, Philistia, Crete, Susa, Anatolia, Canaan, Midian, and from further abroad, would see and be allowed to copy what they wished to take back to their countries. The Enochian inscriptions were so vast they required much abbreviation, and this is what is discovered when studying the oldest writings in the world. Biblical texts are paraphrases of much lengthier materials, and Sumerian, Sanskrit, Vedic, Zoroastrian, Near Eastern and Egyptian writings all mention histories and fragments of a theology that was known to them but lost over time. Correspondences between these earlier human writings preserved today that show remarkable parallels between another, though the cultures had little or no known contact. The Egyptians claimed their greatest writings were discovered in the ground. The Vedic texts claim their own writings came off of the surfaces of the altar of Agni, having 10,800 verses on each of its 10,800 blocks, and that these writings have been dug up. The Hindus claim that long ago their holy books were recovered from the bottom of the ocean after the flood. Abraham's translations became the core prophetic and doctrinal texts by which humankind built their religions. Sanchoniathon of Phoenicia, a scholar who lived and wrote about 1100 BC, links Abraham to Thoth inadvertently, claiming that he had read some of the books of Thoth and that Thoth had lived about 800 years before himself. This is only an approximate that places Thoth at 1900 BC, when Abraham was 47 years old. At approximately 470 BC, Xanthos of Lydia wrote that Zoroaster's ministry was 600 years before the Trojan War. This too is an approximate of great precision. Abraham was remembered as Zoroaster in early Persia, Iran, just as the people of India remembered him as Brahma from Abraham, with his wife Saraswati, Sarah. The Trojan War began in 1239 BC and lasted until 1229 BC, with an international war throughout the Mediterranean involving the Sea Peoples Federation, the Mycenaeans and early Greeks in Egypt. Abraham's ministry in Egypt lasted 12 years to 1825 BC, so Xanthos' timeline is perfect at 600 years. Proof of the Zoroaster-Abraham connection is seen in that at Zoroaster's birth, a sign was seen in the heavens, and a king attempted to slay him as an infant. These things are related in the Book of Jasher for 1947 and 1937 BC. Zoroaster visited Babylon and was hidden away as a youth to endure decades of study and religious devotion. The earliest relics of Zoroaster's writings are the Gathas, dating back to at least the 14th century BC. The Gathas are devoid of the fantastic and are merely fragments of a larger literature, which Pliny estimates as Zoroaster's total writings at 2 million verses. This is doubtful, but is actually a memory of the innumerous texts found upon the Great Pyramid's surface that Abraham translated. The Gathas were regarded as very sacred and have suffered little from editors. They were included in the Avesta, and remarkably, the finest writings are the oldest. The Avestan language is closest to the Sanskrit of the Vedic text of India. Zoroaster's eschatology was extraordinarily advanced, and taught of the day of the Lord and coming of the Saviour, Saoshyant, to bring bodily resurrection to all men, good or evil. This 1837 date in the ancient world when the casing blocks were discovered, excavated and their writings translated at Giza, parallels the 1837 AD when the British Colonel Vyse discovered the buried white limestone casing blocks at the base of the Great Pyramid that scholars had for centuries claimed never existed. The pyramid by 1837 AD was partially buried in rubble. See 1837 BC. 1. The Wars of Gods and Men, when the earth was divided, Sitchin. 2. Genesis, Jubilees. 3. Stolen Legacy. 4. Origin and Evolution of Freemasonry. 5. The Secret in the Bible, Bushby. 6. Rule by Secrecy. 7. Tales of the Prophets. 8. Secrets of Enoch. 9. Kybalion. 10. Secret Teachings of All Ages. 11. The Antediluvian World. 13. The Portable Voltaire. 14. Zoroastrianism. 1834 BC, 2061 AM. The Sodom Trojan Apocalypse Comet Group passes over the ecliptic. 1825 BC, 2070 AM. In the 12th and final year, 144 months, of Abraham's ministry, translating the Giza texts off the surface of the Great Pyramid, planet Phoenix passes through the inner system, completing its 138-year orbit, on its way back out to the Kuiper Belt. Abraham's ministry in Egypt with the Great Pyramid's writings is the subject of Lost Scriptures of Giza, and the orbital history of planet Phoenix is the subject of When the Sun Darkens and Nostradamus and the Planets of Apocalypse, where we find many startling connections between early knowledge of Phoenix, Enoch, Abraham, and the Great Pyramid. The calendrics for this year are intriguing. The end of the pre-flood world was in 2239 BC, or 2070 years after the destruction of the pre-Adamic world in 4309 BC. This year of Abraham's final year in Egypt was the year 2070 Annus Mundi, 414 times 5, and 414 years after the flood. The Great Pyramid was begun and the Sphinx sculpted in 990 Annus Mundi, or 2905 BC. And this year was 990 Anno Pyramid, 990 years since the Giza complex was finished in 2815 BC. The Great Pyramid was elevated on the plateau out of the sea in 1899 BC, 74 years earlier, or 888 months, a golden proportion number. Abraham is 122 years old, and his ancestor was still alive, Shem, at 512 years old. This was the 52nd year since the institution of the Abrahamic covenant. The Word of God as being eternal was originally written past tense. Abraham provided the sages of Egypt, the Near East, the Mediterranean world, India, and abroad a vast corpus of ancient prophetic information concerning the future histories of the world, the apocalypse, and the entire life and messages of the chief cornerstone, Christ, that were taken from the writings once adorning the Great Pyramid. These texts were the original Enochian writings, the antediluvian Word of God, and they were composed in past tense, just as the Old Testament prophecies, composed by the inspiration of men of God, were also written in past tense. As the Word of God is eternal, the composition in past tense serves the purpose of being unchanging, especially in the distant future, when all the prophecies are fulfilled. The original Word does not change, and in the far future no changes will need to be implemented, because the Holy Writ was in past tense to begin with. Unfortunately, this method of eschatological preservation of messages to mankind was later misunderstood as centuries and then millennia passed, leading priests to develop entire religions based upon these holy prophetic records, as if someone named Krishna, Vishnu, Buddha, Mithra, Zoroaster, Quetzalcoatl, Kukulkan, Votan, Viracocha, Indra, among other saviour gods, already existed in the past and fulfilled these prophecies. Abraham, as found in the subject matter of the oldest writings and their teachings that were divulged by all those ancient personalities linked to Abraham, taught that a Saviour was coming who would walk among men, teach them the truth, and promise them resurrection. This Saviour would visit mankind at a predetermined time. The entire structure of the Great Pyramid was built to commemorate his descent from heaven to rule the monument of man. Over time, this story was badly embellished with a solar mythos, adding details not found in the oldest writings, fictions that would be added to the early Christian documents to justify Roman authority over the Church. The origin of Christianity and its predecessor faith, Gnosticism, will be fully disclosed throughout this research. 1822 BC, 2073 AM. Abraham is 125 years old when he relocates to the city of Kirjath Arba, a city built by his kin, the Anakim giants, Sons of Noah and Noah's sons. The city is named City of Arba, one of the firstborn sons of Noah and Namar after the flood, a sister of Semiramis, queen of Babylon and mother-wife of Nimrod. Nimrod was himself still alive and well at 165 years old. Kirjath Arba will later be renamed Hebron, a city famous in biblical history. Isaac is 25 years old, and the venerable Shem is 515 years old. 1821 BC, 2074 AM. Some Philistines steal one of Abraham's wells, a severe violation in antiquity under patriarchal law. In the Bronze Age, such an act would lead to war. Abraham is famous throughout the Fertile Crescent nations, and his name has been found in ancient cuneiform text as Abramu. King Abimelech of Philistia apologizes to Abraham and they enter into a peace agreement. Abimelech did not know it, but he averted a national disaster. This was 414 years after Ham, the ancestor of the Philistines, was cursed for a sexual trespass against Noah involving Namar, 414 being a cursed earth period. This demonstrates that this year of Abimelech's apology extended the cursed time for Philistia to 1407 BC, another 414 years when the Israelite descendants of Abraham would conquer Canaan in the year 2488 Annus Mundi, 1407 BC. This parallels the fact that this was the 2488th year of the Phoenix chronology. The story of Abraham and Abimelech is in Genesis and Jasher. 1 Genesis, 2 Jasher. 1819 BC, 2076 AM. The Masonic text called the Inigo-Jones document records that this is the Annus Mundi year that the Great Pyramid was constructed. Many older Masonic writings mention Abraham and Enoch and the Great Pyramid. This is an apparent anachronism, confusing Abraham's presence in Egypt at the Great Pyramid 4 years earlier in 1825 BC with the construction of the monument. 1807 BC, 2088 AM. Abraham is 140 years old, and he is led to sacrifice Isaac on a mountain altar at the behest of God. Sorrowful but obedient, Abraham takes Isaac, who is then 40 years old. Abraham knows that God has promised that through his seed shall be many mighty nations, and that his descendants would fill the earth. He believed this promise was to be fulfilled through Isaac, his earliest son through an Egyptian princess. Hagar, named Ishmael, was in this year 54 years old. This was exactly 70 years since the Abrahamic covenant was established. Just before Abraham is about to fulfill his oath, a substitute is provided in the form of a ram caught in a nearby thicket. Discovering the matter of the intended sacrifice, the elderly Sarah rushed out and finds Isaac alive and well, and the book of Jasher reads that she was overcome with relief and died at that moment. It was for Sarah that Abraham bought the cave of Machpelah. The Abrahamic covenant is now firmly ratified, and the calendrics for this year bear it out as one of significance. As the Annus Mundi year of 2088, this was 1044 plus 1044, a golden proportion number. This was the year 2232 of the orbital chronology, or 744 times 3, the number 744 being a golden proportion number as well. This year was 1296 of the Vedic calendar, or 432 times 3, also 144 times 9. It was 1008 Anno Pyramid, and 432, 144 times 3 after the flood in 2239 BC. As 92 years after the Babel dispersion, this was 1104 months, or 552 plus 552. Even to events in the future, this was an important year. This year was 360 years to the Exodus in 1447 BC, 400 years to the Israelite conquest of Canaan in 1407 BC, and 1200 years to the fall of Jerusalem to Babylon in 607 BC. This begins an 1840-year countdown to 32 AD, which is 22,080 months, or exactly 552 times 40. The year 32 AD marks the year the chief cornerstone visited men and finalised his work. 1 Jasher, Genesis. 1799 BC, 2096 AM. In this year died the very first man born after the flood, Arphaxad, the firstborn of Shem. He was born 2 years after the flood and was 438 years at his death. His father Shem was still alive, of pre-flood pedigree, 538 years old. This was 1872 years, 144 times 13 of the Jewish calendar, 1 Genesis. 1787 BC, 2108 AM. At age 60, Isaac fathered Jacob and Esau, twins. Both of these males will grow up to have whole nations descended from them that will struggle against one another even as empires rise and fall, descended from both. The three major ethnic groups descended from Abraham are the Arabic nations that have populated the Middle East, from their patriarch Ishmael, who was 74 years old at the birth of Jacob and Esau. Esau's descendants will populate Seir, and some will assimilate with Middle Eastern nations, but the thread of Esau and his hatred of his brother Jacob will find its way to live among the Chittim of Italy, bred into the Roman people, the greatest enemies of Israel. This history will be disclosed fully in this research. The descendants of Jacob will populate the earth in the most fascinating series of migrations in the ancient world, when Israelite tribes and clans become nations and empires. The threads of Ishmael, Esau, and Jacob are followed throughout this work. Abraham in this year is 160 years old, 40 times 4. Shem is 550 years old. God promised to Isaac the same covenant between Abraham and him, this being 90 years after the institution of the Abrahamic covenant, or 1080 months. The Roman historian and chronologist Marcus Varro, as cited by Augustine, related that at this exact time Assyria was ruled by its seventh king, the first Xerxes, who also went by the throne name Balaeus. At this time the first king of Argos ruled, namely Inachus. Argos would later be known as part of Mycenae. Inachus is probably a corruption of Anak, Inachus. The Anakim first settled the Peloponnese after being banished by Nimrod with the Japhethites. In the 3rd century BC, Apollonius of Rhodes, chief custodian of the Library at Alexandria, wrote that the ancient lands of Greece were ruled by the sons of Deucalion. Deucalion was the new wine sailor, the early Greek Noah, and his sons were born after the flood, called the Anakim. When Nimrod led the Hamites against the Japhethites and sons of Noah, he did so after they were already weakened by a disaster, a quake and storm in 1947 BC. They were defeated and banished to the far west, from which the term Tartarus developed. Evidence that Inachus is Anak is found in that the early Greeks claim that Inachus arrived at Argos in a migration escaping a disaster. Even the alliance between the Japhethites' Titans and the people of Inachus is found in that Inachus was associated with Iapetos, who was the Grecian Japheth. Inachus also founded Iopolis, known today as Antioch in Syria. We will review material later showing that the Anakim were also inhabiting Caria and Syria. The city called Argos was not called Argos at this time, a name that will be attributed to it much later. 1 Genesis, 2 Augustine, City of God, 3 Survivors of Atlantis, 5 The Greek Myths. 1777 BC, 2118 AM. After 66 years, 792 months north of the ecliptic, the ancient Earth-killer comet group passes back over the ecliptic on its 396-year orbit. 1776 BC, 2119 AM. 4 years before the death of Nimrod, Assyrian Ninurtu, the Assyrians laid the foundation for the immense temple complex dedicated to Anu and Adad, the gods of heaven and storms, enjoying their newly acquired autonomy. This is 641 years to Tiglath-Pileser's first year of reign in 1135 BC, when this ruined temple was rebuilt and planet Phoenix darkened the sun. By 1135 BC, the Assyrian annals indicate that the temple had been in ruins for 60 years. 772 BC, 2123 AM. Rumours of the rise of a mighty hunter in Canaan filters into the court of Amraphel in Babylon, Nimrod's palace. Nimrod is stirred to jealousy, for he was the original mighty hunter. Nimrod and his personal guards go hunting in the Hule Marsh in Canaan, a pretext for finding the young upstart. As Nimrod separates himself from the men in the hunt, he is himself ambushed by 15-year-old Esau, who was disguised in a boar skin. Esau fights Nimrod, drops the huge king, and decapitates him with his own sword, fulfilling the prophecy that Nimrod would be killed by the seed of Terah, father of Abraham. Nimrod was 215 years when he died. Nimrod's men chased Esau and the youth flees, running all the way back to where Isaac has pitched his tent. When he arrives, he finds his brother Jacob cooking a pot of food. Exhausted from his flight and scared, he trades his birthright for the pot of stew to Jacob. Esau killing Nimrod is the origin for one of the most mysterious and widespread mythological motifs. The boar killing the king story, so prolific in antiquity, a story with variants found in the Middle East, Africa, Asia Minor, Greece, India, and Europe. This is the subject of King of the Giants, mighty hunter of world mythology. Though hundreds of versions of this story are found in Asia, Africa, and Europe, not one single story like this is found in the ancient Americas. In fact, the traditions of early American cultures remember the mighty hunter, his lies, his fall and pride, and even the flood and tower, but none relate how he died. This lends credit to the fact that those people who became the early Americans had already left the Near East, and all contact was for a long time severed with the Old World. After crossing natural land bridges, these passes were then closed over by impassable oceans, as the polar caps melted and receded to their present positions. The death of Nimrod was 127 years after the Tower disaster and beginning of the dispersion. The following year, 1771 BC, begins the first regnal year of Queen Semiramis of Babylon, a woman famous in the writings of the early Near East. Her generation were just reaching old age, as evidenced by the death of Arphaxad. However, her own genetics may have been stronger, for she was the direct daughter of both Noah and Namar, rather than their grandchild. The ruse of masquerading as a pig was used much in antiquity to get the predatory animals like lions or wolves to think the hunter was a foraging pig. The predator would advance on the hunter and then be killed. This is the 175th year of Abraham, and he dies after Nimrod is killed. He was born in the first regnal year of King Nimrod in 1947 BC. Nimrod was a Hamitic king under the curse of Noah. His death was 240 years, 86,400 days, after the golden age of Cronus began, when Ham became king in 2012 BC, 1 Jesher. 1769 BC, 21:26 AM. Salah dies, aged 433 years, of Shemitic lineage, born 37 years after the flood. In this year Jacob, 18 years old, moves into the house of Shem, who was 568 years old. By this time Japheth is dead, as well as Ham, leaving Shem as the oldest man on the planet, born 98 years before the flood. Jacob is the student of the ancient Shem, Melchizedek, just as Abraham was the student under Noah. This was the 108th year since the establishment of the Abrahamic covenant in 1877 BC, 1 Genesis. 1737 BC, 21:58 AM. Shem, the patriarch of all Semitic peoples, at age 600, died. His death ends the ancient Ogdoad, the 8 ancient ones, being Noah and Namar, Japheth, Ham and Shem, with their 3 wives. Of antediluvian pedigree, he did not grow old as others did after the deluge, cellular deterioration as we experience today unknown to them. This agelessness of the pre-flood people was why the biblical record describes Melchizedek as that he had no beginning and no end. His beginning was before the flood, and after the deluge he outlived his sons, grandsons, and great-grandsons. This was the 110th year of Isaac, and the 50th year of Jacob and Esau, 1 Genesis. 1735 BC, 21:60 AM. An Amorite dynasty begins in Egypt, referred to as the Hyksos kings, or foreign rulers. These were also called the shepherd kings. The Amorites of Mitanni by this time have spread across the Fertile Crescent and occupied Syria, Canaan, and Babylonia. The invasion of the Amorite-led armies of Canaan, Babylonia, Mitanni, Philistia, and the Amalekites never conquered the interior of Egypt, but stayed in Lower Egypt, occupying Memphis and On. To the far south, Thebes of Upper Egypt remained autonomous. The Hyksos occupation established a mercantile empire and brought great prosperity to Egypt. It was the dominion of the Hyksos that led to the prominence of the Israelites in Egyptian government. The calendrics for this year are interesting. This was the 2160th year, 1080 times 2, of the Annus Mundi calendar, and 1104 years, 552 times 2, since the beginning of the Anunnaki dynasty, called the Oppression, in 2839 BC, when the 7 Nephilim kings began to rule over the Sethites in the land that would later be called Egypt. This was 1080 years after the completion of the Great Pyramid in 2815 BC in Egypt. The Egyptians were Hamitic, and this loss of Egyptian power was 500 years, 6,000 months, after Noah cursed Ham and his offspring. This occupation of Egypt was 144 years after the Battle of Kuruksata, and the East against the West in 1879 BC. Jacob and Esau were 52 years old. 1731 BC, 2164 AM. Laban, a distant relative of Jacob, fathers twin girls named Leah and Rachel. These two women destined to give birth to the first 12 tribes of Israel. This was 216 years, 108 times 2, since birth of Abraham in 1947 BC. Jacob and Esau are 56 years old, 1 Jesher. 1724 BC, 2171 AM. Isaac is 123 years old and blind. He calls Esau to him and asks him to hunt a fresh kill and cook the meat for him, so he can give him his blessing. Jacob discovers the matter and contrives to steal the blessing from Esau, feeling that he is justified because 48 years earlier, when Esau killed Nimrod and escaped the Babylonian soldiers in the Marsh, had sold his birthright to Jacob for food. Apparently Esau lied, so Jacob cooked some meat and took it into his blind father, pretending to be his brother. Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau was enraged. Jacob flees the wrath of Esau and goes to the house of Eber, who was also a Shemite and at 448 years old was the oldest man alive at the time of the Semitic lineage. Jacob and Esau were 63 years old, 1 Jesher. 1723 BC, 2172 AM. In this year Ishmael dies, first son of Abraham, through Hagar, an Egyptian princess. He lived for 138 years, a phoenix orbit. Jacob was 64 years when Ishmael died. This was the 1948th year of the Jewish calendar, paralleling the birth of Abraham in 1948 AM. This year was also 1380, 138 times 10 of the Vedic calendar, 1 Jesher. 1710 BC, 2185 AM. Jacob travels to his distant relative's home, Laban, and agrees to serve him for 7 years, 25-20 days, to marry Rachel, the twin of Leah, 1 Genesis. 1708 BC, 2187 AM. The ancient Eber dies at age 464, born 67 years after the flood. Eber is the origin of the term Hebrew. Jacob and Esau are 79 years old, 1 Genesis. 1703 BC, 2192 AM. Jacob, aged 84, marries both Rachel and her twin sister Leah. These women were 28 years old, and Jacob had been tricked into accepting Leah as his wife, also by her father Laban. This was 144 years since the birth of Isaac in 1847 BC, an heir to the promises of Abraham, 1 Genesis. 1697 BC, 2198 AM. Jacob is confronted with a figure that he realizes is divine, an angel or avatar of God. He wrestles with the stranger to obtain blessing from God, and in the conflict his hip is broken. The stranger awards him a new name, Israel. The change of one's name was a fundamental tenet of the elder faith, equivalent to receiving atonement, the covering of a spiritual garment. This is why the Revelation text had Christ proclaim that those who believe in him will receive a new name. Through this stranger, God promises Jacob, "And you shall have children of good character, but their multitude shall be innumerable, and they shall leave what they have to a still more numerous posterity, to whom and to whose posterity I will give dominion of all land, and their posterity shall fill the earth and sea." The tribes of Israel would multiply and become mighty and famous nations and empires. Jacob is 90 years old, or 1080 months. 1 Genesis, 2 Josephus Antiquities. 1696 BC, 21:99 AM. Jacob's beloved wife, Rachel, gives birth to Joseph at age 35. This is almost the youngest son of Jacob, and because he was from Rachel, Joseph is his most favoured son. Jacob is 91 years old. This year is 1407 of the Vedic calendar, 1407 BC being the year the Israelites inherit the land of Canaan, 1 Genesis. 1687 BC, 22:08 AM. Planet Phoenix passes through the inner system and transits directly between the orbits of Venus and Earth, darkening the Sun, completing its 138-year orbit. This visitation of Phoenix gave rise to the Bronze Age traditions of the Phoenix bird immersing into the Sun every 5 centuries or so. This year was exactly one Phoenix cycle of 552 years after the Great Flood. By this date, there were at least 120 million people on the planet, this being a very low approximation. In this year, Jacob was 100 years old when his daughter Dinah was abducted by a Canaanite named Shechem. She had been violated, so Jacob's mighty sons slew Shechem and the men of the city. This is the background to an extraordinary story in the book of Jasher. We find that the local Amorite overlords assembled an army of Canaanites to punish the sons of Jacob, but the patriarch prayed to God on the field of battle, and suddenly in the daytime the sun darkened, terrifying the Canaanites, followed by a terrible earthquake. The Canaanites flee, but the sons of Jacob pursue them and effect a great slaughter throughout the Canaanite cities. This was 260 years, 52 times 5, from the birth of Abraham in 1947 BC. The ancient Chinese changed dynasties by what was known as the Mandate of Heaven. When cataclysmic events occurred, it was the belief of the Orientals that this signified a need for dynastic change, that the gods were displeased with human government. The Chinese bamboo books relate that at this time the earth quaked, meteoric rain fell, and there was a 5-planet alignment in 1688 BC. This was the collapse of the Xia dynasty, which was overthrown by a series of yellow fogs, a famine and the darkening of the sun. The fall of the Xia dynasty was specifically due to the darkening of the sun, which some historians link to an eruption of the volcano Thera, because they sought to account for the darkness, not knowing about planet Phoenix. Historian W. J. Perry's work on the archaic civilization was published in his 551-page work entitled Children of the Sun in 1923 AD. He provides a wealth of evidence that the ruling families and dynasties called themselves Children of the Sun during the archaic civilization period, which abruptly ended in warring states and violence about 1688 BC. From this point on, the rulers quit referring to themselves as Children of the Sun, which, until this date, the sun was believed to be perfect and unchanging. The darkening of the sun shattered this old paradigm. Perry concluded by writings, "The destruction of the archaic civilization revealed fresh potentialities in man. Mother right gave way to father right. Military aristocracies came into being. War gods emerged, and the world began to take on a shape that we all recognise." In the chronological records of Marcus Varro, as conveyed by Augustine, the land of Argos in southern Greece was ruled by Phoronius, the son of Inachus, during the latter years of Isaac's life. It was during the reign of Phoronius of Argos, Mycenae, the flood of Ogyges occurred. This disaster afflicted the area that would later be called the Peloponnese. Augustine dates this disaster in the reign of Pharonius. Citing Varros of the race of the Roman people, we read, "There occurred a remarkable celestial portent, for Castor reports that in the brilliant star Venus, called Vesperugo by Plautus, and the lovely Hesperus by Homer, there occurred a strange prodigy, that it changed its colour, size, form, course, which never happened before nor since. Adrastus of Cyzicus and Dion of Naples, famous mathematicians, said that this occurred in the reign of Ogyges. The planet we call Venus today was not originally known by this name. This name is an etymological relic that has caused much historical confusion with that of Phoenix. In fact, the two are phonetically similar. Venus can be Voynix and Phoenix can be Phenus. Planet Venus never altered its course, changed shape, size and colour. What was seen was Phoenix, and evidence of this is the fact that the flood of Ogyges was accompanied by a great darkness. This event is also mentioned by Greek scholar Robert Graves as the flooding of the Thriasian plain, which he asserts was an historic event. The confusion with the planet we now call Venus derives from the fact that Phoenix transited between the orbit of Earth and Venus, crossing the ecliptic plane in a path unknown to the ancients, its passage from north to south. All the other planets, including Venus, follow the ecliptic. Phoenix does not. The Venus solution is commented on by researcher Frank Joseph. Joseph published the findings of elite scientists who met in 1997 AD in the fields of archaeology, archaeoastronomy, geology, paleobotany, climatology, astrophysics, and oceanography, who concluded that they determined by their findings that the ancient world had suffered a series of cataclysmic impacts and disasters. One date focused on, and this was an approximate, was about 1628 BC. This date is only 59 years from 1687 BC. Joseph then cites that this disaster occurred in the 9th year of the reign of King Amazigduga of the Hittites, when the king describes in a stone tablet seeing a great celestial body called Ninsiana that other researchers pass off as Venus according to Joseph. This would have been 1687 BC. The 1629 BC date originated with a scientific analysis of tree ring samples taken from around the world, some even from the ancient bristle pines of California, from seabed deposits and ice cores. These findings gave the approximate of 1628 BC. A closer approximate is the accepted date for earthquakes and floods that destroyed the early civilization of Crete, at about 1700 BC. This is only 13 years off. The destruction collapsed fortifications and preserved for archaeologists evidence that there were indeed giants alive in the Bronze Age. Bat-winged battle axes have been excavated at Crete, measuring a heroic 3.5 feet across, exhibited today on walls. Only men who stood 9 to 11 foot tall could have wielded such massive weapons. As Crete was ruined, so were other Mediterranean ports and cities. The famous story of the flooding of Joppa finds its origin with 1687 BC. Joppa was on the Canaanite coast, close to where Rephaim and Anakim giants resided. Joppa may have been the origin of the stranger Ogyges, who according to the oldest traditions was a leader of giants who washed ashore during the flooding. In fact, Ogyges is a name derived from a root meaning giant. That a disaster occurred is further seen in that stonemasons and architects left their tools laying about the Minoan ruins, as if they were in a hurry to leave. Many of the world's coastlines were permanently changed. A formerly thriving port in South America was shoved upward to an elevation of 12,000 feet, the entire mountainous range of the Andes razed overnight. The city of Tiwanaku, the ruins around Lake Titicaca, Pumapunka, the Urubamba Valley were all elevated and abandoned because of the frigid conditions. The ruins have been dated at approximately 1600 BC by radiocarbon analysis. The famous Gate of the Sun depicted angelic beings coming from heaven, Anunnaki, and a picture of Tammuz, the weeping god so popular in ancient Near Eastern iconography. With Tiwanaku uninhabitable, the people migrated to Cuzco according to ancient Incan tradition. Throughout the entire world, cities and civilizations were laid waste. It is a good assumption that millions of people died. The immense megalithic stoneworks of Baalbek were abandoned, as were those strange statues of heads on Easter Island. Archaeologists baffled as to why whole workshops have been excavated with tools lying about, as if men dropped them where they were. Thousands of islands vanished while others appeared. The basalt city of Metallanim, 11 square miles of gigantic earthworks, colossal pillars, temple edifices and artificial waterways of dense and heavy basement rock on Ponape Island was submerged, tilted and later partially resurfaced, where it lies today between Japan and Hawaii. This ruined city could have supported a population of 1 million people. The same fate was suffered by those who lived among the ruins on Yap Island in the Carolines. In Italy, the Chittim in some communities at the base of Mount Vesuvius were totally buried alive under layers of volcanic pumice and ash at the exact same sites that would later become the Roman cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum that were also buried by the volcano in 79 BC. The island of Malta was also flooded over. The famous Hypogeum is located on Malta, an underground complex of great mystery once housing 7,000 skeletons, though it was not a burial chamber. Also Hagar Quim, a huge megalithic temple on Malta, shows evidence of its tsunami. A 3-foot layer of silt was deposited over the ruins, as well as at Tarxian on Malta, with its massive stone gates of round stones fitted to sockets, and the same 3-foot layer of silt. Gozo Island near Malta has similar ruins, called Gantija Temple, which means work of the giants. In this year, Stonehenge was damaged, and locals on the Isles of what we would later call Britain would erect some of the monuments, the enormous sarcens and the smaller blue stones. This is known as Stonehenge 3. Interestingly, Sir Norman Lockyer, oblivious to this 1687 BC cataclysm, dated the erection of Stonehenge at 1680 BC. That this would be a disastrous year for ancient American cultures is evidenced in the fact that this is 1687-1686 of the Olmec calendar, paralleling the 1687 BC year of our Gregorian dating. Further, this was 3552 Anunnaki chronology, this being a golden proportion number, being 1776 plus 1776. This dating reflects a future disaster in 713 BC, the 2400th year of the Mayan long count, when the solar year will be changed from 360 days a year to 365.25 due to a near collision between Earth and the dark satellite. This year of 1687 BC was 1426 of the Mayan calendar from 3113 BC, or 713 plus 713 years. This transit of Phoenix ends the early Bronze Age, and the demographics of the ancient world is altered. The date is fixed by the rape of Dinah in 1687 BC, by the chronological records of the Book of Jasher, and by the biblical chronologist Stephen Jones in his Secrets of Time. For more on this catastrophe, see When the Sun Darkens. 1. Genesis. 2. Jasher. Secret Cities of Old South America. 4. Voyages of the Pyramid Builders. 5. Survivors of Atlantis. 6. Children of the Sun. 8. Augustine, City of God, Book 18. 9. Augustine, City of God, Book 21. 10. Survivors of Atlantis. 11. The Greek Myths. 14. Egypt, Greece and Rome. 15. Ancient Civilizations. 16. The World's Most Mysterious Objects. 17. Our Haunted Planet. 18. Survivors of Atlantis. 19. Fingerprints of the Gods. 21. Elder Gods of Antiquity. Global disasters and the early Bronze Age. Middle to late Bronze Age begins. 1686 BC, 2209 AM. Rachel, aged 45, gives birth to Benjamin and dies from labour complications. Benjamin is the only son of Jacob, born after his name is changed to Israel. 1 Genesis. 1679 BC, 2216 AM. The 12 sons of Leah sell the firstborn son of Rachel, Joseph, into slavery at age 17 to a merchant caravan travelling into Egypt. In Egypt, he is sold into the slave market in the service of an Egyptian military official known as Potiphar, whose wife sought by various stratagems to seduce the young Joseph into an affair. This situation and her treacherous accusation landed him in prison, and the story is the source of the Egyptian tale of two brothers, which is preserved upon an ancient Egyptian papyrus in the British Museum. The sons of Leah return and tell Jacob, their father, that Joseph was killed by a wild animal. This was the 108th year of the life of Jacob and Esau. 1 Genesis, Jasher. 1667 BC, 2228 AM. Isaac dies at age 180, born in 1847 BC. His sons Jacob and Esau are 120 years old. Augustine wrote that in this year the third king of Argos was now ruling, named Apis. This was 670 years since the birth of Shem before the flood in 2337 BC. This year, 280, 70 times 4 from Abraham's birth, 210 years, 70 by 3 after the institution of the Abrahamic covenant in 1877 BC, and 140, 70 times 2. 1 Genesis, 2 Augustine, City of God, Book 14. 1666 BC, 2229 AM. After several years in prison, Joseph interprets a dream for Pharaoh. He was falsely accused of rape by Potiphar's wife. Dreams troubled the king of Egypt, and Joseph was summoned to interpret them after his unique ability was made known through other prisoners. The dream concerns 7 years of plenty that Egypt would enjoy, followed by 7 years of severe famine. Joseph is instantly elevated in status and proclaimed as Prime Minister of all Hyksos-controlled Egypt at 30 years old, exactly 13 years after being sold into slavery by his brothers, the sons of Leah. Joseph is Prime Minister under a Hyksos king, and it was under these rulers, the shepherd kings of Mesopotamia and Canaan, that the Israelites would flourish. The shepherd kings were an amalgamation of Canaanite-speaking people of Syria-Palestine. Like the Israelites, the Hyksos venerated Seth, who was regarded as Lord of Lower Egypt. Joseph lives in a palace at On, Memphis, the ancient city of Anu that would later be called Heliopolis, the centre of Hyksos government, and he is remembered as the famous and most revered Djoser. Djoser is de Djoser, who was in Phoenicia called Iosepe, the Io resolving to the modern J for Giuseppe, Joseph. This is the year 1447 of the Mayan calendar, paralleling the year 1447 BC, 2448 AM, when the Israelites are led out of Egypt by Moses. 1 Genesis, 3 Phoenicians, 4 God Kings of Outremer, 5 The Christ Conspiracy. 1663 BC, 2232 AM. In this year Joseph turns 34, and he is married to a high priest's daughter. In this year she gives birth to twin boys, who are given Egyptian names. These 2 boys have a special destiny, becoming patriarchs of 2 more tribes that will be adopted into the Israelite families. These 2 will become the patriarchs over whole companies of nations and famous empires in the future. They will be renamed in 1639 BC. The prophet Isaiah wrote that in the days of Joseph, the king of Egypt was a Syrian. The calendrics for this year are stunning and convey the importance of these 2 sons of Joseph. As 2232 Annus Mundi, this is 744 times 3. This is the year 1776 from the descent of the Watchers, a year in the Anno Domini timeline that will begin the United States of America. This was 1440 years after the start of the Black Age, the Kali Yuga being 144 times 10. This was 1152 or 144 times 8 years after the completion of the Great Pyramid in 2815 BC. The Great Pyramid being the ancient seal of Israel, as it is also the seal of the United States. It was at the very site of Goshen, the land around the Great Pyramid, where the Israelites lived in Egypt. This year was 576 years after the Deluge, or 144 times 4. The Abrahamic covenant was reaffirmed in 1807 BC, 144 years earlier. 1 Isaiah. 1659 BC, 22:36 AM. The Great Famine begins and would last for 7 years, predicted through the interpretation of Pharaoh's dream. This dearth would afflict northern Africa, Canaan and parts of Mesopotamia. This is precisely 680 years from the birth of Japheth, or 244,800 days, 2448 number of cataclysm in ancient Egypt, from birth of Japheth in 2339 BC. This year was also the 576th year, 144 times 4, from curse of Ham by Noah in 2235 BC. Abraham had been born 288 years, 144 times 2, earlier in 1947 BC. 1658 BC, 22:37 AM. Joseph's brothers travel to Egypt to buy food, where they meet their own little brother but do not recognize him. Joseph is prime minister and is in all respects Egyptian. 1657 BC, 22:38 AM. The sons of Jacob and Leah, with Benjamin the son of Rachel, are sent back to Egypt from Canaan to buy more food. Joseph, prime minister of Egypt known as Joshua, is 39 years old, and he meets his brothers and reveals his identity to them. Jacob is told that his long-lost beloved son is alive and second in command of Egypt. The house of Israel moves into Egypt and given the land of Goshen around the Great Pyramid complex, the same place that was the centre of Sethite pre-flood civilization. Jacob is 130 years old. Toward the end of this year is exactly 1447 years after start of the Vedic calendar in 3103 BC. The year 1447 BC being the exodus of Israel out of Egypt. This year begins Israel's first year in Egypt. The house of Israel is at this time numbered at 70. However, Ephraim and Manasseh, the two sons of Joseph, Joshua, would later be adopted into Israel by Jacob in 1639 BC, making this number 72. This year is 1656, 552 times 3 years, to the first year of Christ in 1 BC. 1 Genesis, Numbers, Jasher. 1652 BC, 22:43 AM. The Great Famine ends after 7 years. Joseph has enriched the Hyksos dynasty and now begins to build massive architectural monuments in Egypt, raising pyramids, temples, and embarks upon the greatest project in all Egypt outside the Giza complex, the 250 miles of canal works along the Nile. This is done in response to the Nile's failure to rise for 7 years, which caused the famine. This incredibly advanced feat of ancient engineering was designed to regulate the flow of the Nile during the flood season. A massive lake reservoir system was created that also boasted productive fisheries. Even today, the locals call it Bar Jussus, or Canal of Joseph. Herodotus and Pliny both confirm the canal's origin with the Israelites. There are many places in Egypt still bearing Joseph's name. This is the 360th year from Ham's first year on the throne in 2012 BC. 1 Genesis, 2 Ancient Man, citing Scientific American. 1639 BC, 22:56 AM. Jacob, Israel, dies at age 147 in the very beginning of the year. On his deathbed he summoned Joseph and his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, who are both 24 years old. Inspired by God, the old patriarch blessed both of these young men and prophesies that these two men would father mighty empires descended from Israel in the last days. They are renamed Manasseh, forgetful, and Ephraim, doubly fruitful, and formally adopted into the Israelite family. These men were Egyptian by culture, but both Egyptian and Israelite in pedigree. Joseph is told that God has already blessed him beyond all of his sons. So the blessing passed to his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. These will become the 13th tribe. With Benjamin, these future nations are those referred to in Scripture as Rachel's children, the beloved of Jacob. The amazing history of these nations and empires in Europe and America will be revealed in this research. Ephraim will become the mightiest of all peoples ever seen on this earth, the tribe of adoption who has as their national seal the Great Pyramid. The calendrics for the death of Jacob and the Abrahamic blessing, passing on to the two sons of Joseph, is fascinating. This year was 3,600 years, 600 times 6, of the Anunnaki chronology, a system of great years, each 600 years long. It was taught long ago that every 600 years a great man arises or is born. This was the year 2400 since Earth began orbiting the present Sun, and 1800 years, 600 times 3, from 3439 BC, when the Watchers descended from Nibiru, heaven, to Earth. Noah was born 600 years before the flood, in 2839 BC, exactly 1200 years, 600 times 2, before the adoption of Manasseh and Ephraim and death of Jacob. This was 600 years after the deluge in 2239 BC. Because Jacob was born 147 years priorly in 1787 BC, then he was conceived about 270 days earlier, 9 months in the womb. So it's a safe assumption that he was conceived 148 years before he blessed Ephraim and Manasseh, this being 1776 months. At the death of Jacob, the Israelites assemble and follow Joseph, the prime minister, to Canaan to bury their patriarch. Joseph orders the Israelites to march in the funeral procession in a certain positional order around the body of Jacob, their positions serving as prophetic allusions to the distinct future geographical regions the descendants of these men would later possess in the earth. The tribes of Benjamin, Manasseh, and Ephraim are positioned on the west. The procession travels to the cave of Machpelah, which Abraham bought from the Canaanites, Hittites, in 1807 BC, 168 years earlier, to bury Sarah. Joining them were 31 Canaanite kings and their retinues, who honoured the memory of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and his sons. Esau appeared at the cave and attempted to bar the burial, the brother and enemy of Jacob. A battle ensued, and the conflict was evenly matched, as Esau had brought family and retainers. One of the Israelites was named Chusham, who was deaf and mute. The man ran out into the battlefield and slew Esau with a sword and chopped Esau's head off, just as the youthful Esau had decapitated Nimrod in 1772 BC. Joseph and the Israelites prevailed against the enemies, and even took Zepho and others as prisoner, who were bound in chains and taken back to Egypt. This begins the fascinating history of Zepho, the grandson of Esau, who would take the blood of Esau to the land of ancient Italy. In the chronology of Marcus Varro, according to Augustine, in the year Jacob died, the fourth king ruled Argos. This dynasty began with Inachus, then Phornios, Apis, and now Argos. This man was how the city in southern Greece got its name. Argos was not originally called by this name. Varro relates that this begins the nation of the Argives. The Argives will be famously immortalized in the pages of Homer's Iliad. 1. The Christ Conspiracy. 2. Jasher. 4. Augustine, City of God, Book 18. 1625 BC, 2270 AM. The pharaoh that elevated Joseph Djoser in Egypt died, and he is succeeded by his son Magron. He assumed the title Thutmose I, Magron, being his Assyrian Canaanite name. He too was of the Hyksos dynasty. Magron was born in 1666 BC, in the same year that Magron's father made Joseph the prime minister, 41 years priorly. Before his death, he asked Joseph to guide his son Thutmose I in his reign, and throughout his entire reign the co-rulership between Joseph, and Thutmose I never met with any problems. The kings of Egypt regularly had 5 names. These would be a personal name, throne name, dynastic name, and epithets attributed for personal exploits or traits. During their co-rulership, Canaan, Philistia, and Nubia would be subdued and made to pay tribute. 1 Jasher, 2 Ages in Chaos, Volume 1. 1607 BC, 2288 AM. As the Hyksos powers waned, their power base in Mesopotamia at Mitanni, where the Amorites ruled over the Near East but were contending with the rising might of the Hittites, the sons of Esau assemble a massive army of Midianites, Arabians, Ishmaelites, people from Seir and Canaan, in a combined army of 800,000 soldiers. The Egyptians with a small group of Israelites go out to meet the enemy. Out on the frontier, the Egyptians are routed, leaving the Israelites behind as they flee. Fighting fiercely, the Israelites beat back the invaders. Joseph, Diosa, is victorious, and the corpses of the enemy numbered about 200,000. Though they had saved the nation, a fear of the Israelites took root among the people that would later haunt them. One of those that hated the Israelites was Zepho, grandson of Esau, who was already in his 32nd year of slavery in Egypt, after his capture in the battle over the cave of Machpelah, when Esau was killed after the death of Jacob. This was the 50th year of Israel going into Egypt in 1657 BC, 1 Jasher. 1595 BC, 2300 AM. The Hittites of Anatolia, a Japhetic empire throughout Phrygia, Caria, Asia Minor, as far as Ilium, where Troy sits, and Lebanon and Syria with garrisons into Canaan, invade Mesopotamia and overthrow the Amorite dynasty of Babylon, beginning the Hittite dynasty of Babylon. This was 270 years from 1865 BC, when Hammurabi, Nimrod, again led successful Amorite invasions into the west. This overthrow of Amorite power critically weakened the Hyksos control over Egypt and severed the aid the shepherd kings received in the administration of their empire with Assyria and Mesopotamia. This power shift was immediately felt throughout Egypt. Under Hyksos rule, the 2 kingdoms, Lower and Upper Egypt, prospered, and the nation had grown populous and wealthy. This new political climate brought Egyptian nationalism to the forefront. The 270 years of firmly established Amorite control of the Fertile Crescent ended. This was 90 times 3 years, or 1080 plus 1080 plus 1080 months. This was 744 years after Japheth was born before the flood in 2339 BC, 252 years from the birth of Isaac, and 62 years since the Israelites had entered Egypt, or 744 months. 1585 BC, 2310 AM. At the beginning of the year, Joseph, Diosa, aged 110, died, and the Egyptians mourn and bury him in the tombs of the kings, known to us as the Valley of the Kings. This area is placed under heavy Egyptian guard due to a state secret concerning a prophecy uttered by the sorcerers of Egypt, that when the bones of Diosa are removed from Egypt, the land will suffer great plagues and darkness. At the start of the year when Joseph died, it was still the 71st year since Jacob brought his house from Canaan to live in Egypt. Also in this year, King Magron died, known better as Thutmose I, after exactly 40 years of co-rulership of Lower Egypt with Diosa, Joseph. Thutmose I is succeeded by his son Thutmose II, whose reign would only last 9 years. The death of Joseph, Thutmose I, and the prophecy of Joseph's bones occur 138 years, 1656 months, being 552 times 3, or 414 times 4, before the fulfillment of the prediction in 1447 BC, with the 10 plagues on Egypt and exodus of Israel. Joseph's death begins a 20-year period according to the book of Jasher, wherein all the patriarchs of Israel die off, leaving only Joseph's sons Manasseh and Ephraim alive after 1565 BC. The order of their deaths and ages is Zebulun at 114, Simeon at 120, Reuben at 125, Dan at 123, Issachar at 122, Asher at 123, Gad at 125, Judah at 129, Naphtali at 129, and Levi the last at 137. Interestingly, coins from Egypt once thought to be amulets bear Joseph's name in hieroglyphics, as well as his Egyptian title, Saba Sabani, the coins having an image of Joseph with a cow, a reference to Pharaoh's dream of the 7 fat cows followed by the 7 lean cows, the famine. This was publicised by Dr. Saeed Mohammed Tabet of Egypt in 2009 AD. According to Augustine, at the death of Joseph in Egypt, the 4th king of Argos still reigned in southern Greece, Argus. That the ancient chroniclers like Marcus Varro and those before him so diligently recorded the dynasty of Old Mycenae denotes the importance of this government to the ancients. This people were the direct descendants not of Japheth, Shem or Ham, but of Noah and Namar, a lineage born after the flood and founded by the powerful Anakim. Toward the end of the year, we arrive at the 72nd year since the Israelites moved into Egypt, thus concluding the narrative of the book of Genesis. 1. Testament of Simeon. 2. Jasher. 4. World Net Daily, cited by William Dankebring, Augustine, City of God, Book 18. 1584 BC, 23:11 AM. Sometime during the previous year when Joseph died, the grandson of Esau named Zepho and his kin escaped Egypt, after 54 years of bondage under the Israelites. Zepho escapes to Libya and becomes a war general under King Angeas, beginning his 50 years of rule to 1534 BC. At that time King Angeas desires to marry a beautiful daughter of a man named Uzu, who was regarded as a local god in Italia among the Chittim. Her name was Jania. After formally requesting the girl, the Chittim refused him because they had arranged her marriage to someone else. King Angeas of Libya was enraged, and allied with Sardinia, he made war against the Chittim. Hearing of the alliance, King Turnus of Chittim launched his ships from Italia to Sardinia and defeated them. Then the Libyans sailed to Italia and fought Turnus between 2 places called Alphanu and Roma, a pre-Roman site, and the Chittim were defeated. Jania was captured and taken to King Angeas. This begins the ancestral hatred between Italy, Rome, and northern Africa, Libya and Carthage. It is known that sailing from Egypt to Rome takes 16 days, but Libya is closer than Egypt. The people called Romans have not yet arrived to Italia. They would arrive and then amalgamate with the local populace. For this reason, the early Jews called the Romans by the name of Kittim. Zepho took part in these battles. 1. Jasher. 3. The Jesus Papers. 1581 BC, 23:14 AM. Zepho, grandson of Esau and general over King Angeas' army in Libya, has repeatedly tried to persuade King Angeas to make war against Egypt. It is widely known that the political situation in Egypt is unstable. The shepherd king's power base in Assyria and Mesopotamia has weakened by the Hittite takeover. But Zepho's true ambition is revenge against the Israelites for the death of his grandfather Esau and his enslavement for 54 years. But King Angeas refuses. Enraged, Zepho travels to Chittim, Italia, and lives among the populace, becoming a hero when he kills a strange creature hiding in caves that had been killing off local livestock. This begins the line of Esau among the people of Italy, a spirit of hatred against the Israelites that would manifest over and over throughout history in the annals of Roman Europe. This date is precisely 828 years, 414 plus 414, or 2 cursed earth periods, before the 753 BC famous founding of Rome. Back in Libya in this year, Queen Jania of Chittim, who married King Angeas of Libya, fell ill, but was made better after ships sent to Italia returned with water and soil from her homeland. 1 Jasher. 1580 BC, 23:15 AM. Libyan ships plundered the coasts of Chittim, Italia. Zepho, now a hero among the people of Chittim, assembled a force of locals and began repelling the Libyans, which resulted in the people electing him as king. Zepho built an army almost overnight and set out and conquered Sicily and other islands, and began extending his domain through all of Italia, one Jasher. 1576 BC, 2319 AM. Thutmose II of Egypt died, and he is succeeded by Amenhotep. His wife is the famous Queen Hatshepsut, who enjoys a reign of 21 years of peace. In this year, Thutmose III is born, a man who would later overthrow his mother and initiate a heavy oppression over Israel. Amenhotep is a native Egyptian ruler under the Hyksos dynasty, but Hatshepsut is an Amorite princess, now a queen. A reference to Phoenix is found in a Greek papyrus translation of an older Egyptian text, dating from the reign of Amenhotep, for in the Typhon time the sun is veiled. Typhon is etymologically related to Phoenix. The Egyptians too knew that it darkened the sun. There is no evidence that Phoenix appeared during the reign of Amenhotep. This is merely an Egyptian reference to the phenomenon. Phoenix would not appear until 1549 BC, 6 years after the death of Amenhotep. This is the 81st year since the Israelites took up residence in Egypt. 1 Ages in Chaos, Volume 1. 1567 BC, 2328 AM. This is 40 years after the Canaanite invasion of Egypt, instigated by Esau's sons in 1607 BC, that was slaughtered by the force of defending Israelites. This prior invasion was in the reign of Thutmose I, also called Ahmose. After the Canaanite invaders were defeated, the Egyptians made deep incursions into Canaan and further north to Syria, this being a Hyksos dynasty occupation from their centre at Lower Egypt. Now in 1567 BC, the king of Kadesh in northern Syria leads a confederacy of Syrians, Hittites and Canaanites into Egypt. This invasion is unsuccessful, for Thutmose III defeated the confederacy at Megiddo, Valley of Armageddon. But Kadesh still posed a threat. The name Kadesh means holy city, and some researchers believe that this is a reference to the city of Jerusalem, a popular Canaanite stronghold. Thutmose III now begins a series of 17 military campaigns against Canaan and Syria. The historical archaeological record perfectly complements the chronological record of the Book of Jasher. The dating of this event is precise. The international politics behind the Syrian Confederation is due to the Hittite presence in the north and northeast, as well as the waning of the Amorite powers that strengthened what the Egyptian terms as the Hyksos foreign rulers. The land of Canaan and Syria were a buffer zone between two empires, the Hittites and Amorites. The calendrics for this year are astonishing. As this involved a major historical war fought at Armageddon, we find it interesting that this is the exact midpoint in the entire Anunnaki chronology, the 7344 years, 2448 times 3, of the entire chronology, which is also encoded within the chronometry of the Great Pyramid. 1567 BC is 3672 years before Armageddon, and also 3672 years into the Anunnaki chronology, which began in 5239 BC. 3672 plus 3672 is 7344. This year is the 1872nd year, 144 times 13, from the descendant of the Watchers in 3439 BC, and the 90th year, 1080 months, since the Israelites entered Egypt in 1657 BC. 1. Hitchhiker's Guide to Armageddon. 1565 BC, 23:30 AM. The Shepherd Kings heavily fortified Tanis and Memphis in Lower Egypt. Upper Egypt has become mighty, a separate nationalistic Egyptian government. The Hyksos Assyrians, Babylonians, Canaanites, and are also members of the Sea Peoples Federation. The Hittites continue to garrison Canaan and Syria as the power of the Amorites wanes. The Hyksos relinquish control over Libya and Nubia and concentrate on their holdings in the east, which are quickly being absorbed by the Hittites. The Amorites of Mitanni are already Hittite sympathizers, and Thutmose III, now 3 years after defeating Kadesh, marches his army across Canaan and into Mesopotamia, across the Euphrates River in Babylonia and crushes the kingdom of Mitanni. He intensifies Egyptian expansion into Palestine, Syria, and northward, opposing the Hittite presence. He overruns Canaan, and the kings of Canaan become Egyptian vassals, which explains why 120 years later, in 1445 BC, the Canaanite kings sent clay tablet messages to Pharaoh to protect him from the invading Upper Hebrews. The text called the Amarna documents. Because the Hyksos power begins to wane, the Libyans more freely send out plundering expeditions to different islands. They again raid the coast of the Chittim in Italia, and again Zepho drives them off. This was the 670th year since Noah proclaimed the curse on Ham and Canaan in 2235 BC, and the 92nd year from the Israelites entering Egypt. Israelites forced to labour this year. 1. Hitchhiker's Guide to Armageddon. 2. Jasher. 1555 BC, 2340 AM. This begins the narrative of the book of Exodus, which was 108 years before the exodus of Israel from Egypt in 1447 BC. This year was also the 108th year of the lives of both Manasseh and Ephraim, sons of Joseph, born in 1663 BC. Amenhotep died, leaving his wife Hatshepsut of Amorite pedigree on the throne. Amenhotep's son Melol assumed the throne named Thutmose III, and the exploits his father performed were attributed to himself, like the famous Battle of Kadesh in 1567 BC. The son assumed the deeds of his father because he continued his reign by sitting on the throne of Egypt beside his own mother, Hatshepsut, wife of Amenhotep. Thutmose III was a nationalist ruler, secretly against the Hyksos occupation. His mother would continue to rule Egypt with him for 22 more years, until he forcibly removes her from the throne. This in Jasher is considered the first year of the oppression of the Israelites. This was the 102nd year since the Israelites entered Egypt, being 1224 months. The sum of 1224 will resurface throughout its chronology, over and over, concerning Israelite and Israelite-descended peoples and their timelines. 1224 is half of 2448, 2448 AM being year of Exodus in 1447 BC. This was the year 2484 since the Earth had entered this newer orbit, or 414 times 6, as this was 1260 from the completion of the Great Pyramid, built by the Sethite ancestors of the Israelites. It was also 252 years after the Abrahamic covenant was confirmed in 1807 BC, 1260 being 252 times 5. As this year marks the rise of a king of Egypt, not sympathetic to the Israelites, we see this year as 680 years after the curse of Ham and Canaan by Noah in 2235 BC, or 244,800 days, 680 times 360, the number 2448 AM being 1447 BC, the Exodus and judgments upon Egypt. As a result of the growing population of Israel in Goshen of Lower Egypt, a conspiracy is hatched. Slowly, over a course of weeks and months, Egyptian labourers and residents of Egyptian origin living among the Israelites slowly begin departing, leaving nothing but Israelites and other foreigners at all the laboured details, setting the stage for their complete subjugation. In this year, Libyan ships under the order of King Angeas plunder the coast of Chittim, Italia. Zepho, king of the Chittim and grandson of Esau, captured and killed them all. King Angeas of Libya is enraged and assembles his forces and allies while Zepho sends messages to his kin in Edom to come to his aid, but they refused. Desperate, the people of Chittim, being Etruscans, Latins and Sabines, remembered that Zepho was the great-grandson of Abraham, the famed patriarch who withstood Nimrod prior to the great dispersion at Babel. They begged Zepho to humble himself and pray to the God of Abraham and Isaac, whom they had heard about. Zepho listened to reason and complied, and God instantly strengthened the people of Chittim, who then defeated the Libyan hosts, even felling their great general Sosiftar. King Angeas escaped with his son Asdrubal. This same scenario will be repeated in 207 BC, when the Carthaginian African general Asdrubal was defeated by the Romans Chittim in the Punic Wars. After the defeat of Libya, the Chaldean seer and magi Balaam, who was originally from Mesopotamia, leaves the court of Angeas in Libya and takes up residence with Zepho in Italia. Zepho, after securing his victory despite the odds and intervention of God, quickly abandoned the God of Abraham and Isaac and began heathen practices. Zepho amassed a great army of Chittim, and they sailed to Canaan, where they joined armies of his kin in Edom and Ishmaelites. With these combined armies, Zepho attacked Egypt and fought at the valley of Pathros, initially defeating the Egyptians but stopped by an inferior army of Israelites. This battle during the reign of Thutmose III was exactly 52 years after the last time Egypt was invaded by Canaanites, Ishmaelites and Edomites, and with the same result. This battle was 324 years, 108 times 3, after the famous Battle of Kuruksata in 1879 BC. Zepho escapes back to Chittim. Many of his kin, the descendants of Esau, removed from Edom and joined him in Italia, becoming members of the nobility. 1 Jasher. 1549 BC, 2346 AM. Planet Phoenix passes through the inner solar system and passes over the ecliptic, completing its 138-year orbit on its way back out to the distant Kuiper belt. This was the 108th year of the Israelites entering into Egypt in 1657 BC. This is the year 2760, 552 times 5 of the Phoenix chronology, no record of it being visible. 1548 BC, 2347 AM. The Sodom Trojan Apocalypse Comet Group passes over the ecliptic in a train of debris after 286 years south of the ecliptic plane, unseen at this time. 1547 BC, 2348 AM. By this date, Thutmose III of Egypt had subdued all of Canaan and much of Phoenicia and Syria in almost 20 years of campaigning. This is the 110th year of the Israelites going into Egypt, and exactly 100 years before their exodus from Egypt in 1447 BC. 1534 BC, 2361 AM. Zepho, grandson of Esau and king of Italia, Chittim, died, 50 years after his escape from bondage under Israel in Egypt. He had been a prisoner of Israel for 54 years since Esau died, opposing the burial of Jacob in 1639 BC. Zepho had fought and been captured, but his age is never given. If he had been fighting at age 16, he would have been 120 years old when he died. However, he could have been much older. He is buried in the city of Nabna in Italia, and was succeeded by King Jannaeus, origin of Roman Janus. The seer Balaam flees Italia and takes up residence in the house of Pharaoh in Egypt, and begins to advise the king of Egypt on the problem of the growing population of the Israelites, no doubt having spent time with Zepho, who was influenced against the children of Israel. 1 Jasher. 1533 BC, 2362 AM. After passing over the ecliptic for 15 years, completing their 301-year orbit, the Sodom Trojan Apocalypse Comet Group passes in close proximity to Earth. A comet is seen brilliantly in the heavens by the Chinese and Egyptians. According to the Tulai Papyrus, the priests of Karnak recorded that in the 22nd year of Thutmose III, there appeared an extremely brilliant comet, one very different than those of old. The reference to 22 years is a reference to the fact that Thutmose III did not truly rule Egypt until after he seized total power from his mother Hatshepsut in this year, 22 years after the death of his father Amenhotep. The Tulai Papyrus describes that the comet, disk of fire, broke apart in the sky and became smaller disks. Thutmose III immediately begins killing off his political rivals and enemies in mock trials for fictitious offences. He becomes a tyrannical dictator. According to the 2nd century AD Bishop of Antioch named Theophilus, the Egyptian king Thutmose is referred to as the pharaoh that began the oppression. According to Exodus 2:23, Thutmose reigned for a long time and was succeeded by Amasis, who according to Manetho, the priest historian of Alexandria, Egypt, was Ramesses. This was the 124th year of the Israelites coming into Egypt, and yet the oppression was not yet in full operation. Conditions for the Israelites had gradually worsened, but still they maintained freedoms and privileges. Though labour conscription was occurring and the Israelites with some other foreigners were the backbone of the manual labour force, They were still at this time relatively free. This year was the 414th year, cursed earth period, from the birth of Abraham in 1947 BC, which was also the first regnal year of Nimrod. 1. The end of Eden. Author Phillips believes this date is 1486 BC, 47 years off, but this is due to wrong chronology employed by him for Thutmose III. 4. The Wars of Gods and Men, Abraham, the fateful year Sitchin. 1531 BC, 2364 AM. The Amorite-founded Hyksos dynasty ends after 204 years, 2448 months over Lower Egypt. Paralleling the year 2448 Annus Mundi, 1447 BC, when the Israelites flee Egypt in the Exodus. This is 84 years before the Exodus. Interestingly, one of the Hyksos kings bears that same non-Egyptian name as one of the gigantic sons of Anak, who is found in the biblical record named Sheshai. In fact, in 1445 BC, when the spies of Israel go into the interior of Canaan, they come face to face with a giant named Sheshai, a son of Anak described as enormous. This is further evidence that ancient Mycenae, Argos, was part of the Hyksos Federation. With collapse of Hyksos dynasty in Egypt, Thutmose III is in complete control of all Egypt, lower and upper. A council is held on what to do about the swelling population of foreigners in Lower Egypt, especially Israel. The Egyptians express amazement at how fast the Israelites had multiplied in that 126 years they had been in Egypt, that they only seemed to increase in numbers with the more assignments given to them. Pharaoh published a formal decree for the male children of all newborn Israelites to be killed. Israelites are forced to build pyramids, funerary complexes, and cities. Historians note that it was during the reign of Thutmose III that Egyptian records first mentioned the institution of slavery. This was the 276th year from the confirmation of the Abrahamic covenant in 1807 BC, 276 being 138 plus 138. 1. Flying serpents and dragons, 2. Jasher, 3. The end of Eden. 1527 BC, 2368 AM. In the 130th year of the Israelites in Egypt, Pharaoh Thutmose III has a dream of an old man holding up a pair of balances, scales, a symbol of judgment, with Egypt's mighty and nobles in one scale and a milk kid in the other, Israel, the kid outweighing all of Egypt. Balaam the seer interpreted this dream to mean that a deliverer had been born in Egypt, an evil arising against Egypt. Again, Thutmose III orders the death of all male children, ordering that they be cast into the Nile. The prior order had been largely ignored, but now the slave status of Israel is acknowledged throughout Egypt, and the murder of Israelites was now obeyed. This is considered the first year of the oppression, the year Moses was born. This repeats the prior pattern set by the birth of Noah in 2839 BC, who was born in the first year of the Sethite oppression by the Nephilim dynasty before the flood, and Abraham, who was born in 1947 BC, in the first regnal year of the wicked Nimrod, 420 years before the birth of Moses. 70 times 6. As officers are sent among the Israelites to hunt and execute children, the Hebrews begin hiding their babies in back rooms, but Egyptian women begin the cruel practice of entering the houses of Israelites with their own infants to torment those women who lost their babies. The Egyptian women would pinch their own babies to make them cry, which induced hidden Hebrew babies to start crying, which were then reported to the Egyptian officers. Moses is born, prophesied by elder faith traditions as the coming of the lawgiver. He is named Shemaiah, and Moses is only the name he received by later generations, who had forgotten his real name. The name Moses is a relic of the Egyptian title from Teth Moses, the king. Nimrod had usurped the prophecies in an attempt to gain the faith of the people that he was the predicted lawgiver, which the Amorites accepted when he was sitting on the throne as Hammurabi, the lawgiver. But the laws Hammurabi gave the people venerated the Anunnaki, as seen on the famous code of Hammurabi Stele. Nimrod, as Sargon I of Akkad, claimed to have been born and then hunted, placed in a basket by a river, and found by someone of importance. Nimrod tried to emulate each capacity of the elder faith prophecies: the shepherd, the conqueror, the giant killer, the king, the saviour, the lawgiver, all roles later fulfilled by Abraham, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, Joshua, and David. These were prophetic foreshadowings of the coming of the deliverer, the Christ. Manetho of Alexandria wrote that Moses received a priestly education at Memphis, and that he was rescued from the Nile by the daughter of Pharaoh, raised in a royal court, and in his life he became famous for his military exploits. According to Augustine, at the birth of Moses, the fifth king was then ruling Argos, named Croesus. The dominant people in the Peloponnese was now the Argives. This year was 260 years, 52 times 5, since the birth of Jacob in 1787 BC, and 350 years, 70 times 5, from the institution of the Abraham covenant in 1877 BC, 280 years, 70 times 4, since it was confirmed in 1807 BC, 1 Jasher. 4. Origin and evolution of religion. 6. Augustine, Book 18, City of God. 1515 BC, 2380 AM. Thutmose III, using Israelite slave labour, had the Sphinx excavated at Giza, which was made in 2905 BC by the Sethites, the ancestors of the Israelites who built the Great Pyramid complex, that was completed in 2815 BC, exactly 1300 years earlier. The Sphinx was partially buried, and Thutmose III had a stele placed between the paws of the Sphinx, which reads that the temple area of the Sphinx had been built in the first time of the domain of Set. Set is an Egyptian memory of Seth or Sethites. Thutmose III also erected at the city of Memphis 4 colossal pillars that would one day be placed on ships and carried to the empires descended from the very Israelites that erected them in Egypt. One would be placed on the Thames River in England, and the other in New York City of the United States, these two latter-day empires being the 13th tribe of Israel, the tribe of adoption. The seal of Israel would forever be the Great Pyramid, United States, and the Sphinx, Great Britain's old seal. This was the 432nd year since the birth of Abraham in 1947 BC, and the 720th year from the curse of Ham, which includes Egypt, made in 2235 BC. 1513 BC, 2382 AM. The fourth Baktun, 144,000 days, complete of the Mayan long count, this being a total of 576,000 days since 3113 BC on the 360-day year system of the ancients. Amazingly, this is the 144th year that Israel was living in Egypt since 1657 BC. 1509 BC, 2386 AM. Moses visited his Israelite parents in Goshen. His real Egyptian name is not known, but his Hebrew name was Shemaiah. In Goshen he saw firsthand how his people were treated, and even killed an Egyptian soldier who raped a Hebrew woman, while her husband was tied and forced to watch. The matter was reported, and Pharaoh sought to kill Moses, but he fled Egypt and took up residence in Ethiopia, Cush, among the court. He would remain there for 9 years before the people elected him king. This was the 148th year of the Israelites going into Egypt, or 1776 months, 1 Jasher. 1504 BC, 2391 AM. The dark satellite, a former rock and metal moon of Nibiru, passes through the inner solar system unnoticed. 1500 BC, 2395 AM. King Kikianus of Cush, Ethiopia, died, and Moses is made king by the people. He is then married to Kikianus' wife, Queen Adoniah, a Cushite woman. Moses was 27 years old, and his reign would last 40 years over the Africans. This was the 157th year of the Israelites going down into Egypt, 1 Jasher. 1489 BC, 2406 AM. The Anunnaki planet Nibiru reaches aphelion far out in the Kuiper belt, furthest distance from the Sun, after 366 years, when it passed over the ecliptic in the inner solar system in 1855 BC. It now starts its 366 years back toward the inner system. 1485 BC, 2410 AM. Caleb was born in Egypt, an Israelite later to become one of the heroic spies that goes into the land of Canaan, and personally sees the gigantic sons of Anak. In this year the men of Ephraim prematurely invade Canaan, believing that the allotted period of their enslavement is over. The other Israelites do not join them. The Ephraimites are slaughtered by the Philistines, 30,000 men dying. 20,000 of the Philistines are killed. Only 10 men of Ephraim make it back to Egypt. This was the 172nd year of Israel in Egypt since 1657 BC, and one cursed earth period of 4114 years after the Babel dispersion in 1899 BC. 1 Jasher, Joshua, Chronicles. 1484 BC, 2411 AM. King Junius of Italia, Chittim, died after 50 years of rule, the successor of Zepho. This was the 16th year Moses ruled over Cush, Ethiopia. King Angeas of Libya, the enemy of Zepho, also died in this year. He was succeeded by his son Asdrubal. This will be a name to remember. King Junius is interred in a huge funerary complex in Italia that takes 6 years to build. His burial will not occur until 1478 BC, and during this time no one will be elected king over the Chittim and interregnum period. 1 Jasher. 1481 BC, 24:14 AM. In the 176th year of the Israelites going into Egypt in 1657 BC, Dardanus founds the famous city of Troy and the Trojan state of Ilium on the coast of Asia Minor. This was 34 years prior to the exodus of Israel from Egypt, as related in Petavius' History of the World. Troy would continue for 252 years to 1229 BC, when a Mycenaean-led Greek invasion force destroys the city and scatters the people during a major Mediterranean Sea Peoples Federation war. 1. Tracing our ancestors. 1478 BC, 24:17 AM. After King Junius is buried in a massive funerary complex that required 6 years of labour to construct, Latinus is made king of Italia, and he builds a huge navy in this the 22nd year Moses was king of Cush, Ethiopia. Latinus through history is a name to remember. In this his first regnal year, the Chittim attack Libya about 15 days' sail. The Africans are defeated and King Asdrubal is killed. His daughter Ushpezania is captured and married to Latinus. The Chittim depart back to Italia, and the Libyans after this defeat make Asdrubal's younger brother king, Hannibal. This was 106 years after Libya first attacked the Chittim in 1584 BC. The Libyans attacked Italia also in 1580, 1565 and 1555 BC. This was the first time the Chittim ever attacked Libya. This invasion was early in the year. In this same year, King Hannibal of Libya puts together a navy and invades Chittim with his entire army, winning many victories over the Chittim in land battles in an overseas campaign that lasts 18 years. This is precisely what occurred 1260 years later in 218 BC in the Second Punic War, when the people of the North African coast, Carthage, were at war with Rome. In 218 BC, the Carthaginian general Hannibal, invaded Italy with his African army and almost made it to the walls of Rome in a war lasting 18 years on Roman soil, further demonstrating that the past can be reflected in future events. In 207 BC, during this war, the brother of Hannibal was killed, his name being Asdrubal. Beginning in 1478 BC, the book of Jasher reads clearly, "And Hannibal continued the war for 18 years with the children of Chittim, and Hannibal dwelt in the land of Chittim and encamped there for a long time." 1 Jasher. 1461 BC, 24:34 AM. In the 196th year of the Israelites entering Egypt in 1657 BC, Pharaoh Thutmose III died in agony and shame after a bone-breaking chariot accident that terminated 10 years of leprosy and boils that afflicted him. Thutmose III had lived 115 years, 1380 months, being 138 times 10, a lifespan not uncommon at that time. Moses would live to 120 years. In this year Moses was 66 years old, 792 months. This death came 72 years after 1533 BC, when all of Egypt wondered at the sight of a strange comet. Thutmose III's son succeeds him, the famous Ramesses, who had reigned for 14 years before drowning in the Red Sea, chasing the Israelites in 1447 BC. This was the 196th year of Israel's presence in Egypt. 1460 BC, 24:35 AM. This was a bad year for the people descended from Ham. Ham took the throne in 2012 BC after the flood, exactly 552 years before this 1460 BC date. The Phoenix cycle, a duration that ends with cataclysm, destructions and ruinations. After 18 years, the Libyo-Latin War ends after the Chittim counterattacked Libya and Annibal, unable to conquer them in Italia, returned to fight on his own soil. The whole campaign was a loss of wealth and men. The Libyans were a Hamitic people. Another branch of Hamitic line were the Cushites, who are persuaded in this year by Queen Adoniah to send Moses away because he was not like them, and he would not lay with her to produce an heir. Her son by the former king, Kikianus, was old enough to reign over Cush, and he was the same race they were. Moses left with many presents and travelled to Midian, but the Midianites mistook him for an escaped prisoner and imprisoned him, where he would stay for 10 years. Moses was in fact left in a cave for dead, but a woman named Zipporah saved him by feeding him secretly. Had Moses stayed in Cush, he would have begun a memorable dynasty, and his departure was their loss. 1 Jasher. 1450 BC, 24:45 AM. Moses is released from his Midianite dungeon after it is revealed that Zipporah had been keeping him alive. He is married to Zipporah. His confinement lasted 10 years. 1447 BC, 24:48 AM. This is the most pivotal year in world history. The year Bronze Age Egypt collapsed in a series of disasters, quakes, and astronomical phenomena. The Israelites, with foreigners among them, fled into Saudi Arabia, and Moses led the Israelites through the wilderness. Before we can review everything that occurred in this year, we must first review these astonishing calendrics. René Andrew Boulay, an historian employed formerly with the National Space Agency, NSA, as a cryptologist and reporter on intelligence activities, an antiquarian and chronologist, wrote, "Scholars agree that the key to establishing the time of events in biblical times hinges on fixing the time of the Exodus. His own calculations place the Exodus at 1447 BC. The renowned researcher and author of Ages in Chaos named Immanuel Velikovsky wrote that computations have been made which indicate 1447 as the year of the Exodus. Biblical chronologist and author of Secrets in Time places the date of the Exodus exactly on 1447 BC, a researcher who used the scriptures, the Book of Jasher, the Jubilees text and the Syrian eponyms to arrive at this date. In Jones' research, the year 1447 BC was also the year 2448 AM, Annus Mundi. In the old Jewish Seder Hadaroth, the plagues on Egypt and Exodus took place in the Hebrew year 2448. Having no idea when the Exodus occurred, the authors Patrick Gerrell in Geno Ratinex independently discovered that the Egyptian number for cataclysm was 2448. The sum of 2448 years is exactly a third of the entire Anunnaki chronology, from 5239 BC to 2106 AD, when they are destroyed by the chief cornerstone. As found in Chronotecture, Lost Science of Prophetic Engineering, the number 2448 is found prominently in the measurements of the Great Pyramid. Even chronologists long ago almost got the date right. Hevelius in Cometographia, 1668 AM, wrote, "In the year of the world, Annus Mundi 2453, he was 5 years off. According to certain authorities, a comet was seen in Syria, Babylonia, India, in the sign Jo, in the form of a dish, at the very time when the Israelites were on their march from Egypt to the Promised Land. The exodus of the Israelites is placed by Calvisius in the year of the world 2453. The biblical method of dating the Exodus and Egyptian disasters results with the same 1447 BC, 2448 AM date. According to the Book of Exodus, the Israelites escaped Egypt 430 years after their sojourn in Egypt began, beginning in 1877 BC, when Abraham was told by God his descendants would be captive in Egypt. This was the institution of the Abrahamic covenant. The church father and historian Eusebius, over 15 centuries ago, in his own Chronicon, wrote that the Exodus occurred 430 years after God and Abraham entered into a covenant. We will review more amazing calendrics before we conclude our review of 1447 BC. Egyptologists claim there is no evidence of the Exodus and 1447 BC disaster. However, the entire history of Egypt after this period denotes that these events did indeed occur. Further, the Egyptian Ipuwer text reads that plagues and darkness afflicted Egypt and was foretold to the ancestors. Remember that it was prophesied that if the bones of Joseph were removed from the tombs of the kings, then Egypt would be destroyed. Interestingly, we read that at the Exodus the Israelites took the bones of the patriarchs and Joseph out of the tombs to carry them into Canaan, according to the testament of Simeon. The removal of the bones is mentioned in the book of Jasher. In his Admonitions of a Sage, Ipuwer wrote that what the pyramid has hidden is now empty. Before the Israelites left, they went inside the Great Pyramid and retrieved 3 artifacts from before the flood: gold, incense, and myrrh, objects that would serve as signs of the presence of God on earth in the future. Ipuwer wrote that the plague struck Egypt, the sun covered in darkness, people cowered in fear, blood was everywhere, and whole cities were destroyed. This is confirmed in 2 Esdras, where we read that the whole world suffered an earthquake as heavenly omens, troubled the men of the age. Ipuwer also mentions that Crete was cut off in this year, and he lamented the loss of spices, cedar, and wares the Cretan merchants brought to Egypt. The disaster was due to the near pass of the ancient Earth-killer comet group, which passed close to the Earth after 330 years below the ecliptic. Plagues break out all over Egypt and quite possibly the world, Tacitus writing that the horrible epidemic disfigured the body. The Haggadah text of the Jews reads that the 10th plague on Egypt was the worst, for the majority of all Egyptian fatalities during this episode were during the 10th plague. Velikovsky cites records that the Egyptian disaster caused by a comet and detailed by Roman historian Campester and the Egyptian Petasiris was a fact well attested by others. The Chinese Mawangdui Silk Almanac tells of a great comet with 10 tails that Graham Phillips dates at approximately 1500 BC. This would be the origin of the 10 plagues motif, his dating only 53 years off. Phillips relates that the 10 tails literally filled the heavens. Eusebius quoted a lost book of Artapanus, who in turn quoted an older source that claimed that the 10th plague on Egypt was accompanied by a major quake that felled many temples and structures. In Exodus we find that Moses stretched forth his hand toward heaven, and there was thick darkness over the land of Egypt 3 days. They saw not one another, neither rose any from his place for 3 days. Josephus in Antiquities wrote that the Egyptians could hardly breathe, their breath hindered by the thick air, volcanic ash or extraterrestrial dust, and they died miserably. The darkness and volcanic ash leads us to a well-proven fact of history. The Egyptian scribe Ipuwer mentioned the loss of Crete, and this has been the conclusion of archaeologists as well. Crete, with its palatial city Knossos, was destroyed by quakes, tidal waves, and these were the result of the eruption of Santorini at Thera, an eruption that also destroyed Mycenae. At Thera, colossal skulls once belonging to giants were found under ruined Cyclopean masonry. And at Knossos was a gigantic bronze sword longer than any known sword in Europe, gold-plated on the hilt and with a crystal-faceted knob. According to Aegean historian Chester Starr, Knossos fell approximately 1450 BC, this estimate of course being only 3 years off. Concerning Knossos, H.G. Wells wrote, "But about 1400 BC disaster came, perhaps very suddenly upon its prosperity. The palace of Minos was destroyed, and its ruins have never been rebuilt or inhabited from that day to this. Nature alone may have destroyed Knossos, or the Greeks may have finished what the earthquake began." Knossos was resplendent with realistic art, surprisingly modern women's apparel, hairstyles, advanced plumbing and sewage systems and drainage. Baker, in Life of the Ancient East on page 392, wrote, "It took the European world more than 3,000 years to regain the sanitary knowledge which was lost when the Minoan Empire collapsed. Mycenae 3 begins. The civilization begun by the Anakim giants having been destroyed in 1687 BC, with the fall of the early Bronze Age or Archaic civilization, and the disaster in 1447 BC ruining Mycenae, Argos, a second time. With Mycenae 3, there was a shift in construction methods, and pottery exhibits major Minoan influences because the people of Knossos came ashore from the ruined islands. The Linear A script of Minoan Crete ceases, and the survivors developed Linear B by adjusting it to other Proto-Greek scripts. Many of the megalithic cities and temples destroyed in 1687 BC at the Phoenix Cataclysm and rebuilt which are destroyed again in 1447 BC are abandoned for good, overtaken by the deserts, the jungles and coasts. 1447 BC is precisely 240 years of 360 days a year each, or 86,400 days after the 1687 BC cataclysm. Concerning Europe, a particularly old tradition relates that Pharaoh in Egypt ordered his bricklaying slaves to leave the country when an epidemic threatened the people. Many people under Danaus, tribe of Dan, sailed to Greece and Asia Minor, while the majority followed Moses by land to Canaan. Aeschylus in Suppliants wrote that the Danoi came to Greece after being slaves in Egypt. The Danoi were the people of the divine seed. The Greek history of Cecrops begins the traditional history of Athens. Cecrops came to the city that would later be called Athens in Greece from Argos, but it was known that he had earlier come from Egypt. When he arrived at Athens, the city was suffering famine. The Athenian Acropolis then guarded a sacred olive tree, the symbol of Abrahamic origin. In the ruinous destruction of Egypt, there were many peoples escaping Africa, and ancient Greek traditions hold. At this time in early Athens, Thebes and Argos appeared people fleeing Egypt. The history of the tribe of Dan, ancient Israelite mariners, is a history of the early Greeks. The legends of Danaus and his 50 daughters sailing from Egypt to Argos is the memory of a migration of people of Israelite origin who became the Danaan of the Peloponnesus and Asia Minor. The Israelite migrations to ancient Greekdom and the Aegean will be disclosed in this research. When the Israelites departed Egypt, they took a census and found that they had 603,550 men of war, aged 20 and older, not counting the tribe of Levi. Biblical critics have disbelieved this, basing their calculations by modern birth rate statistics. But today, very few families have the children our predecessors did. In antiquity, it was the honour of a woman to produce as many children as she could, and men sought to increase their houses by having many children. The institution of concubines was for the purpose in antiquity of increasing one's house. But even ignoring the fact that historic records indicate that many women had as many as 20 children in a lifetime, we will stay with the lowest possible statistics. What is found is surprising. The Israelites entered Egypt in 1657 BC, and scriptures read that they entered as a family of 70. But this 70 included Jacob, his sons, 12 men, and their wives and concubines. The Exodus occurred 10 years, 70 times 3 later. Here are the statistics for just 30 women having 3 girls in a 20-year period. 20 years is 90 girls, 40 years is 270 girls, 60 years is 810 girls, 180 years is 590 490 girls, 210 years is 2,657,205 girls. This 2,657,205 are only females. Double this and we have an Israelite population of 5,314,410. With half this population dead by the year 1447 BC, we still have the same 2,657,205. These statistics multiply only after 20-year intervals. Therefore, Israel could easily have been 5 million people strong at the Exodus with 603,550 men of war. The Israelites passed over the dry bed of the Red Sea, led by Moses, and we have monumental evidence from Egypt that this occurred. A black granite monument at El Arish relates that Pharaoh, during a period of affliction, died in a whirlpool at Pi Karoti. The text of Exodus 14:9 calls the site of the drowning as Pi-hahiroth. The moment has Pharaoh's name as Thom, related to Pi-thom, a city that Israelite slaves built for Pharaoh. Another monument is found in an 11.5-ton red granite pillar discovered on the coast of the Red Sea on the shore of Nuweiba. It was 14 foot high, and an identical pillar was found on the Saudi Arabian side of the Gulf of Aqaba. They were probably erected by Solomon to commemorate the Red Sea crossing. American archaeologist Ron Wyatt in the early 1980s researched the area on site and took photos of a coral bridge at the site of the crossing, below the water, with horse skeletons and ancient chariot parts under the Red Sea. Dr. Lennart Moller studied remains of horse and human skeletons in coral, along with chariot wheels, axles, and even an intact chariot from the Red Sea. The Israelite travelled to Mount Sinai, which according to Galatians 4:25 is in Arabia, not where the Roman Catholic Church has officially declared it. It is not in the Sinai Peninsula. Moses received the law from God, Mosaic law, beginning a 1480-year timeline to 34 AD, or end of 33 AD. Geometrical expert Bonnie Gaunt demonstrates that this 1480 years was from the Passover of the angel of death over Egypt, that spared the Israelites who put lamb's blood over their doorposts, and the crucifixion of Christ, anointed one, the Lamb of God. She notes that the geometrical value for Christ in Greek is 1480. Others hold that the 1480 years ends with the Holy Spirit descending upon the apostles after the crucifixion. This year of 2448 AM is exactly 3552 years before Armageddon, and the end of the 6,000 years of man's banishment began in 3895 BC. This 3552 years ends in 2106 AD, and 3552 is a major golden proportion number, being 1776 plus 1776. This foreshadows the 1776 Anno Domini year, when the 13th tribe, Ephraim, begins, the tribe of adoption, a last days Israelite empire. 3552 is 1184 times 3, and the geometrical value of chief cornerstone in 1184, C1 Peter 2:6, who is depicted over the pyramid on the Great Seal of the United States. Throne of God in Revelation 22:1 is also 1184. 3552 is also 888 times 4, 888 being a golden proportion number, and the value of the salvation of our God in Hebrews as found in Isaiah 52:10. In Greek, 888 is the geometrical value for Jesus. These two are the conclusions of Gaunt. The Exodus year of 1447 BC is exactly 1461 years after the ascent and disappearance of Enoch from earth in 2908 BC. This mystery is deepened by the fact that the ancient Egyptians called this period of time, 1461 years, a Sothic cycle. This period may seem without significance, but a closer inspection of this timeline reveals a closer connection to Enoch. At this time in history, the year was 360 days and would not change until 713 BC by a near cataclysm. When it changed, it would become 365.25 days, and the duration of 1461 is precisely 365.25 times 4. But the Exodus and this timeline, the Sothic cycles, was connected to Enoch, who disappeared from off the earth. This 365.25 is the exact length of time in years Enoch was on earth before the flood, from his birth in 3273 BC to his ascent into heaven in 2908 BC. This is connected to the 1447 BC Exodus event, just as the Exodus is connected to 2106 AD by the golden proportion, a planetary exodus. The Israelites received the law on the 50th day after the Passover in Egypt, and this 50-day period was instituted every year until he pulls his people out of this world. This paralleled the New Testament event of Pentecost, which was 50 days after the crucifixion when the Holy Spirit descended upon the apostles. With the death of Pharaoh's firstborn son after the catastrophic episode, and the Israelites gone, Amenhotep II ascended the throne of Egypt. His son, Amenhotep III, would later assume the dynastic title Thutmose IV. This year was the 2592nd year since Earth entered this new orbit, or 864 times 3. In the Vedic calendar, the Kali Yuga, it was 1656 years, or 4 cursed Earth periods of 414 years, or 3 552-year periods. The Exodus was 792 years after the Deluge in 2239 BC. It was the 500th year since the birth of Abraham in 1947 BC. 414 years, cursed Earth period, since the birth of Ishmael, who was born to an Egyptian woman in 1861 BC. And 400 years after the birth of Isaac. The law was given to the Israelites 360 years after the Abrahamic covenant was confirmed in 1807 BC. 1. Flying serpents and dragons. 2. Ages in chaos. 3. The Great Pyramid, its divine message table. 4. The Orion prophecy. 5. Worlds in collision, Velikovsky. 6. Augustine, City of God, Book 16. 7. America and Great Britain, Our Identity Revealed. 8. Testament of Simeon. 9. Civilizational Barbarism. 10. Esdras 3:18. 11. Tacitus, The Histories, Book 5. 12. Secret Places of the Lion. 13. Worlds in Collision, Velikovsky. 14. The End of Eden. 16. Ages in Chaos, Volume 1. 17. Exodus. 18. Antiquities, 214. 19. Secret Cities of Old South America. 20. Sargon the Magnificent. 21. The Origins of Greek Civilization. 22. A Short History of the World. 23. Sargon the Magnificent. 24. The Origin of Greek Civilization. 25. Aryan Sun Myths. 26. Post-captivity names of Israel. 27. Numbers. 28. William Dankerbring, who was the real pharaoh of the Exodus. 29. William Dankenbring, The Exodus, mere myth or historical fact. 30. The Exodus case, new discoveries confirm the historical Exodus. 31. Stones and the Scarlet Thread. 32. Secret Places of the Lion.